Now to the second session, the Strategic Plan Goal 1 report, and I will be turning this over to Dr. Duran and Dr. Presidio.
All right, so part two, change from SOAs. So today we're here, the team of individuals here, you know all of them, I'm sure. Maura Burke from the Office of Early Childhood, Rich Polio from East South Services, Jen Glazer, who was up a few times with me previously, College and Career Counseling, Noel Komenko, K-12 Curriculum, and Dr. Presidio, Instructional Services. So the team is here to engage more deeply into our Goal 1 report. This year we have one report for Goal 1, not Part A and Part B. And if you notice, when we combined both, it was actually the same amount of information as when we had two separate ones. So, I mean, in other words, we cut it in half. But the team did a really good job of thinking how to prioritize and present the information in a more meaningful way that I think will help the board process and give us some feedback. So on that note, the very first slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Presidio to walk us through. I think it's important as you're listening today to our presentation that you think about the 6 school board considerations on this slide. We do not want this presentation to be just giving you data, just sharing updates. Certainly that's important for you all to have updates and have the data. But what's more important is what does that mean? And how does that impact all of us, but certainly you as individual school board members? So we've identified 6 considerations for you to think about through this conversation. And really, as you see some of the data points that we're going to be highlighting, really understand the need that we have to continue to prioritize and focus our resources on closing opportunity, access, and achievement gaps. And it's been a part of the conversation we talked about in our strategic plan. But I think today, as you hear about some of the components, the initiatives, the activities, and the data pieces that you're going to hear from today, why this is so valuable and needed. The second thing is that we must continue to work with our Fairfax County partners in the government side. And I know that Ms. McLaughlin and Ms. Darnat Koufax have been leaders on this, but we all can work more closely on equitable school readiness, thinking about early childhood, and you'll see some of the data points as it relates to that. Also, as we think about our English language learners and having the appropriate time to develop their proficiency and also the accountability. And we talked in our last presentation about some of the great things that we have been able to accomplish through our advocacy, but we still need more, and you'll see and hear more about that. The fourth one is, something, again, we were focused on a few minutes ago, but how do we consider to reduce the number of mandated assessments, but also more importantly, the impact that has on teaching and learning? Because one thing, as I reflect upon our last conversation right before lunch, I couldn't agree more that having assessments are critical, but what is it about teaching and learning that we expect from our classroom and our students? It's not just that if we have a test, then that means that's an important subject for us to consider. So when we talked about the history and social sciences and we heard your concerns, we want to say that, yes, history and social science is very, very important, but it's not simply by having an SOL assessment that makes it important. It's through all the work that we're going to be doing and are doing, and you'll hear some of that in our presentation today. And it is still something that teachers know that what is more valuable to them is the type of supports and initiatives we can put in place to help their teaching and learning that you're going to hear from the team today, rather than do we have an SOL assessment that's going to hold them accountable to doing that work. So there's the balance. There's a medium line, but there's certainly a balance that we want to look at that. And then last area is around the flexibility and state graduation requirements. We touched a little bit on that, and the team is going to be coming back to a future work session, I believe next month in May. I think it's May 14th, if I'm correct. So you will be coming back on May 14th to talk a little bit more about that, but you'll hear today some of the highlights as it relates to strategic plan work. So again, think about, as we are sharing with you this report, how you might fit into one of these areas as a school board member. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Presidio.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I think it's great, actually, that this presentation is scheduled right after the Standards of Accreditation presentation, because a lot of the conversation that the board had, we might bring some of that conversation into our discussion here today. In addition to the directors that are here with me at the table, I would like to thank and appreciate and recognize some of the other folks that are in the room from the Department of Special Services, from the Office of Student Testing, who worked really hard on this report with us as well. And also the Office of Professional Learning and Family Engagement. So there are other folks in the room that can be able to help us answer some of the board's questions. So again, as I mentioned on Thursday night, we have a really lengthy report of 150 pages, and it's a lot to try to get through. I'm going to do my best to walk through the high-level slides that we've prepared for today. And to do that, though, I did want to start out with a little bit of a context and just kind of remind folks really in the community that might be looking at this work session, the demographics of the students in our school system. So you can see from the chart that we are by far the largest school system in the state, educating almost 50% of all the state students. But what's more interesting are those teal colored bars representing the number of free and reduced lunch and English learners. So approximately 29% of our students qualify for free and reduced meals and are English learners. And we educate 34% of the state's English learner population, which is huge. So on Thursday, some of the board members really asked to think about how some of these variables and these demographics intersect. What do we see in terms of our intersection of English language proficiency and economically disadvantaged students in our school system? And we're going to dig into that when we look at some of the specific data points. But just in general, I think it's important to note that when you look at the data, about 20% of our FCPS students are both economically disadvantaged and English learners. So I'm going to say that one more time because that is a big number. About 20% of our students in Fairfax are both economically disadvantaged, qualifying for free and reduced meals, and English learners. So those are students that have multiple risk factors when we're talking about student performance and student achievement. So to start out the presentation, I would like to highlight just a few of the successes at the division level for last year, which I think are really noteworthy. You know, first of all, 91% of our students graduate on time within a 4-year time span. 70% of our students pass one or more AP or IB courses. 74% of our students participate in work-based learning before they graduate. 25% have earned a biliteracy seal. And I think of important note is the fact that FCPS students continue to outscore students in the nation and the state on national and international exams, so the SAT, the ACT, and the Pisa. Additionally, we had 750 slots that we've added in our early childhood program since 2012, and the number of credits that English learners have earned has more than doubled since 2015. So there's a lot of successes, as we know, that we really want to recognize and celebrate before we start to dig into some of the specific data. So as a reminder, our Strategic Plan Goal 1 has 4 strategies, and this presentation is organized around each of the 4 strategies. And as we begin to dig into the report, recognizing that there's so much information here to cover, just as a reminder to the community that Goal 1 is about 40% of the entire strategic plan, right? So we have 4 goals in the strategic plan. Goal 1 is about 40%. It has 12 outcomes, 33 actions, and 18 metrics. So that's an awful lot to try to get through. We're not going to get through all of that today. That's why the report is 150 pages long, to try to get through all of that. But what we've tried to do today is really organize today's work session around the most significant desired outcomes and performance metrics. And we can dig into the attached narrative report and look at some of the things that you might want to look at in more detail, either today or in subsequent one-on-one conversations or follow-up work sessions. But today we're going to start with Strategy 1, and you see the desired outcomes here, that our curriculum is going to reflect portrait of a graduate outcomes, that achievement gaps will be eliminated, that teachers, students, and parents will have access to contemporary and effective technology resources, that all students will demonstrate digital citizenship skills, and that central support will be available to support student achievement needs. So Strategy 1 contains an awful lot that we're trying to address. And just a few of the highlights, we've seen gains in both reading and math on our SOL pass rates over a multi-year time frame. We'll dig into that in just a second. We've seen that increase in the number of credits that English language learners are earning. We've seen a lot of additional work and support being done around digital citizenship. And we've definitely seen a large number of our students in schools where we had accreditation issues making large achievement gains, and that's really, really promising. Of course, as I mentioned on Thursday, there's still challenges. The main challenge for us is to continue to think about how we're going to address and close opportunity, access, and achievement gaps. And then part of that is really thinking about the equity access around technology. So the following slides as we start here are organized based on the desired outcome. So the desired outcome here is that achievement gaps will be eliminated, and the data that's provided is an approved metric by the board that's related to that particular desired outcome. And here we're looking at our overall reading pass rates. So our overall reading pass rates for the division as a whole, all of the grades where we test students on SOLs and reading, average together. And when you look at the data here, you see positive 5-year trends for all of these particular subgroups. And there is variation from year to year, and that's why I've included these slides that allow us to look at year-over-year trends. But I think for right now, it's probably more helpful actually to look at the high-level trends over a multi-year time frame, because you're going to see some variance from year to year. There's no question about that. But when we look over a multi-year time frame, all right. See, that's why it takes several of us to run this presentation. That's good. I appreciate that. But when you look at the trends over a multi-year time frame, it allows us, I think, to have that higher level conversation as a good starting point. Now, even though the trends here are positive, some of the board questions following Thursday were for us to really kind of consider, well, how do we see some of these variables playing out again? Poverty, English language development, and ethnicity. So I want to move to the next demographic slide, where we still see positive trend results for all of these subgroups. Economically disadvantaged students, English learners, up almost 10%, and students with disabilities. But when we start to really unpack the intersection of poverty and language proficiency here, we can start to see the impact on student achievement. So a piece of information that's not represented on this slide, but that the board had asked me to prepare, which I think is important, is, first of all, we need to recognize that when we're looking at this data, we're talking about the students that took reading tests last year. So this is not every student in the school system, because reading tests are not given at every grade. They start in grade 3, okay? So these are students just taking reading tests, but 66% of the students in these data are both economically disadvantaged and English learners, okay? So when you think about the intersection here between economically disadvantaged and English learner population, 66% of the students here share both of those categories. Does that make sense? Okay, I got people confused. Okay.
You said at the beginning that the crossover rate was 20%.
These are for the district-wide. These are for these particular tests. Yep. I know, we're going to dig into the data, so stick with me. Okay. So,
Understood.
so
20%.
stay with me on these slides, and then we'll go back and we'll talk about the division as a whole, okay?
Sloan, just one thought, because it was the same thing. I'm a processor mind too.
Yeah.
Can you just repeat what you said one more time for some people to hear what you said one more time?
Yes. So when we've calculated the information in these data here, students that are taking these reading tests, and we've gone through and we pulled the information from the state to look at how many students share both of these characteristics, 66% of our students are both economically disadvantaged and English learners. Yeah. Yes, in these subgroups here, okay? So now, when we start to think about those additional risk factors that you're going to have if you are still trying to learn English, right, and become proficient in English, but you still have the risk factors associated with poverty and economic disadvantage, then obviously that's going to have an impact on your student performance. The piece that I think is really important here, though, is when we start to look at some of these subgroups, we do need to recognize their risk factors, but we also need to be really careful not to stigmatize certain groups as well. So when we look at just our English language learners' performance and we look at the current performance right now on reading is 68%. But if you look at our students that are former English language learners, the pass rate on these reading tests is 95%. So when our students develop English proficiency, they're able to pass at higher rates than our division average. And we've talked about that in previous presentations on student achievement before, that it's a real strength and benefit when those students develop proficiency, but it takes time for them to get there.
You know, Sloan, I know they're going to ask you questions, and I shouldn't be. Well, maybe I should be. I think one of the things as we go forward in reporting this is each of those statements are slides for our community to understand. One, the pool of all those folks taking those reading tests is high economically disadvantaged and high English language learner. And then when you start to take those English language learners, I forgot how you phrased it, but post-English language learner, post-ESOL, right, their success rate after they're with us and they exit those services is just tremendous. So I think that's important. Part of this equity discussion that we're going to continue to have as a board and a school system is really making sure people understand the whole context of data. And I think we as staff presenting to the board will need to do even better to bring all of that context as people look at it before assumptions are made or assertions are made about our own students and what we're doing to help them perform well.
Okay, so when I met with the meeting managers, we did say that we wanted to try to go through all these slides, and I appreciate how difficult that's going to be, so I'm going to defer to our meeting managers if they want to change the rules of engagement.
No, thank you, Dr. Presidio, for reminding everyone what I said Thursday night. We really, including
I broke
Dr.
the rules,
Brabrand.
Sloan. I'm sorry. I wasn't in the meeting.
And Dr. Presidio, one of the things we always have to balance is, what the board has reviewed, but then also making sure that the public who watches this has a sense. But I would definitely say going to the high-level themes, which I think you heard from us talking Thursday night, this board's very mindful of when you talk about student achievement, trying to distinguish out the fact that there are multiple factors that play a role in achievement gaps, and it's not just individual subgroups by race and ethnicity or just by poverty or just by English as a second language. A lot of times we have overlapping categories just within one population of students, and they all play a role in making things difficult when you're talking about poverty and you're talking about English as a second language and then special education.
Absolutely. So I'll continue to try to unpack and look at some of those intersections of the different demographic variables in some of the subsequent slides. But what I'd like to do is just kind of, again, go back to the main point or the nugget really of all of this is that obviously we have some students that are facing multiple risk factors. And our English language learners are the ones that are really facing the biggest risk factors. And we know that they can be successful. So the things that we're doing and really focusing on as a school system right now as it pertains to supporting students around reading, the third bullet here is really probably the most important, is really working with our schools to support them in implementing the new English learner program standards. And we've developed program standards that really focus on research-based best practices and really aim to provide guidance to our schools in terms of the kinds of services that they need to ensure that their students receive so that we can do everything possible to accelerate their language development. So again, that's focusing on their reading skills, yes, but also their speaking skills and their listening skills, which have to come first, and their writing skills, which are just as important, and working to make sure that all of those 4 domains are developing as quickly as possible. So that is a big area of focus for us. Additionally, we're in our first year of the rollout, division-wide rollout at the elementary school of our universal screener. And as you know, this is a formative assessment that really is used as a screening tool to identify students that have risk factors associated with foundational literacy skills. Things like phonological awareness, right? You can just think of your phonics skills. And I will tell you that while no new initiative is without its challenges, we're seeing really good results. And from using this screener, we've been able to identify a larger percentage of students who demonstrate risk factors and get support services and intervention services to them earlier than what we've been able to do in the past. And we think over the coming years that's going to have a big impact on our literacy programming and our literacy student achievement scores. Additionally, we're working to make sure that we can roll out with fidelity in all of our schools our updated curriculum. And we're in our first year of full rollout of our new curriculum, or what we refer to as our planning and pacing guides at the elementary level, which again is providing teachers with resources to use with their students, designed around more than just the content standards and early literacy skills, but also designed with some of those concepts around portrait of a graduate and where we want our students to be. So it's a very integrated approach to providing teachers with the resources that they need to provide effective instruction. So we're excited about that work. And then we, of course, continue to work on supporting our content area teachers in terms of their work in providing support to students with disabilities in their classrooms. So those are the major areas of focus for us right now around reading. So now we'll turn to math. And again, we're still talking about the desired outcome of closing the achievement gap, and we're looking at math as our performance metric here. And again, we see positive trends across all of the subgroups, which is really good. Certainly when you take those apart from year to year, you're going to see variation. But similar to what we saw in reading, here we can also see that intersection of some of these variables like poverty and language proficiency. So if you look at the demographic subgroups for economically disadvantaged students and English learners, again, we see a correlation here across some of these variables. So in math, we see that in this data set, again, 63% of our economically disadvantaged students are also English learners. And it's kind of tricky because these data sets are different. The N size is different based on the number of students taking the test. But again, you see a really large correlation with students that are economically disadvantaged and English learners. So similar to what we saw in reading, when we look at the pass rate of our former English learners in math, the pass rate is 90%, again, above the division average. So again, it just goes to show that when we can get our students the time and the supports necessary to develop their English proficiency, they're performing quite well.
Okay, this is just a clarifying point. You cannot take a subgroup that's known as former English language and then apply it to the all and say they're performing above the all, because the all includes them. So you would have to do all less. So in order to get to what the true number is to see if they're outperforming, you would have to say, what is all minus economically disadvantaged English language learner students with disabilities, so that you have the remainder. That's a Venn diagram that...
No, you're absolutely correct. There's no question about that. I was just trying to keep it as a high level, as simple as possible, and probably a better way to state it would be that if the board were thinking about establishing a performance benchmark like we were talking about in the SOAs that was higher than the state, say, for example, the board chose to set it at 90%. Our former English language learners are actually performing quite high. So that's just the point I'm trying to make. But I appreciate the clarification because you're definitely right about the statistics. Yeah. Okay. So in terms of our math area of focus, some of the things that we're working on include the adoption of our new curriculum resources. And we're in the process right now of that adoption. And some of the benefits of these resources include the fact that we can more differentiate and personalize some of the curriculum in terms of practice problems and support that students need, additional accessibility for students who are English language learners, and then the opportunity to have embedded professional development materials and resources embedded in the materials that we're adopting. We're also working very hard to strengthen our participation for historically underrepresented populations in advanced math. So that's advanced math, or what might be referred to as level 4 AAP math. Sometimes we think of it that way at the elementary level. and Algebra 1 prior to 8th grade. So we're working on that. And then, of course, a big area of focus, not just in the Department of Special Services, but also in instructional services, is, again, supporting our content teachers and being able to better serve students with disabilities in the mainstream classroom. Sorry, I was jumping ahead too far there. So the next indicator, still on the desired outcome of closing achievement gaps, is taking a look at our graduation rates. So here we're looking at our 4-year on-time graduation rate for the class of 2017. And for the first time, you'll see that there is a negative trend here. And we need to unpack that a little bit in relation to our Hispanic students. And it can really be explained, I think, in large part by the intersection of some of these variables that we've been talking about. So I think the first thing when we look at our Hispanic students here, though, and trying to understand this data, is that we do know that a large number of our Hispanic students are English learners, and I'm going to get to that in just a second. But again, when we start to control for some of these variables, we see, I think, how performance is impacted by some of these variables. So when we look at the graduation rate for Hispanic students that are non-English learners, the graduation rate is 93%. Right? So we're looking at a graduation rate for Hispanic students of 74% here. But when we pull out the English language learners and just look at Hispanic students who are non-English language learners, the graduation rate is 93%. The graduation rate for Hispanic English learners is only 55% for the class of 2017.
Just for clarification, when you say non-English language learners with a 93%, you say?
93%.
93%. It's a non-English language learners include former ELLs.
So
whether
So here's the thing. We have to always be careful on some of these data because the business rules can be different from data set to data set. So I would need to kind of double and triple check that. But I'm looking at Mr. Polio, and I believe that includes former English language learners.
Yes, I'll have to look at it, but we'll check on that. It should include some former English language learners in the non-English learner set, and then the English learners are the current English learners.
Yeah, but again, I just want to caution that the business rules when we get the data from VDOE and when we get the data internally, sometimes those can be a little different. Okay. So I think a big nugget here really is kind of thinking about what are we, what are some of our challenges in terms of serving English language learners at the high school level? And when you look at the graduation rate for English language learners, you can see that is actually trending up, and that's positive. And when we start to kind of unpack, well, why is that? A large part of the explanation for that is really the high school redesign work that this board supported us doing several years ago, and we've continued to scale that work and ensure that all of our English language learners and all of our high schools have access to credit-bearing courses as soon as they enter high school. And the data, I think, is really quite impressive when you look at the number of credits that students have earned from 2015 to 2017 in just a 2-year period of time. We've really seen a dramatic increase in the number of credits that students are taking. And some board members might remember when we looked at this issue that we had a lot of English language learners previously who were earning credits. They were just earning elective credit because we hadn't figured out how to make our core academic classwork and courses accessible and available to students where they could be successful. So this is just a 2-year period of time, and we think when we continue to see how these students that started with us in 2015 as 9th graders and have been earning more and more credits, we think the graduation rate for English learners is going to increase. And again, since we have such a large percentage of our Hispanic students who are actually English learners, we think our Hispanic graduation rate will increase as well. So the big nugget here as we think about our graduation area of focus, is continuing to really make sure that the supports that we've put in place in our high schools are there for our students. And we know that the board is continued to look at our results from our new high school programming, and we've continued to look at ways to expand resources and supports, whether it's classroom supports, counseling supports, wraparound service supports that our students need to be successful at the high school level. Another major focus for us is around our graduation completion index, and Dr. Duran and Ms. Huffman talked about that during the previous SOA presentation, that we're really working with our schools to make sure that the administrators, the counselors, and the teachers in the schools understand the GCI calculation and are working with students to make sure that they're getting all the supports that they need to be successful. And it looks like Dr. Brabrand wants to jump in here.
Sloan, tell me if this is right, just as a nugget for the board. We've had the GCI for some time, but we've got a tool now where principals really can calculate within their school what that GCI is. Isn't that right? Is that a true statement?
That is a true statement.
Okay, so I just want to do a story real quick for the board. I know it's me. That I'm violating the thing, but I want the board to understand this around GCI and, hey, there's a dip. This is a place, graduation rate's a place where the overall's down one touch and the Hispanic students is down a little bit. You hear we're getting more credits at high school, but here's the nugget I want you to get, a Fairfax nugget. I think I was a pretty good high school principal. I had no clue what the GCI was for my school. No clue. We've now put this tool in front of principals. When I went down to Lynchburg, they knew it. Their life was riding on it, right? Their accreditation status. They had developed the tool from several years back, and they were tracking it almost like you would track daily attendance. So we've given a tool to our principals that now real time they can be looking at how I'm doing GCI-wise. Well, when something's put in front of you like that, it makes you think about your kids and your school a little differently. And I think just that sense of accountability, putting the right tool sometimes in front of someone to know this is something that's important. You just heard earlier from Francisco's, we're tightening up the dropout rate, and the GCI benchmark is going up. So we're bringing a tool to the school for our principals that really is going to have them have a brighter focus on this than they've had before.
All right, thank you. So just a few other supports that we're working on. One, again, we mentioned this during the SOA presentation, is that we're working on changes to local graduation requirements, and we've got that work session coming up in May, and also continuing to work on marketing our existing opportunities around our career pathways, because we really have quite a few that are available to students already, and not all of our students necessarily take full advantage of those. So this is the completion of the first desired outcome. We've got 13 desired outcomes. So I promised our meeting managers that I would take 45 minutes, and we're at 32 minutes. So I'm going to try to go a little bit faster so that we can preserve as much time as possible for discussion. Our next desired outcome is around providing central supports for schools and staff based on student achievement needs. And every year, the board receives a report around Project Momentum, and we provide a lot of detailed information. And this graph basically just depicts the overall success of that particular initiative. And you can see how much progress we've made over a 5-year period of time in reducing the number of schools that are not fully accredited. Now, the last year on here that's in yellow, 18-19, is a bit of a prediction. As we said earlier today, we suspect that there will probably be a couple schools that are not fully accredited there. The next desired outcome is around our curriculum reflecting Portrait of a Graduate outcomes, where all students are appropriately challenged. And we have a lot of innovative work that's happening in the division right now around Portrait of a Graduate, around things like project-based learning, performance-based assessment, global classroom projects that are happening. But what we're focusing on here, those things are sometimes kind of hard to measure, right? That's great innovative work that's happening in our schools, but sometimes it's hard to measure that. So the associated metric with this particular outcome looks at our SAT scores in comparison to the state average and the national average. And you can see that we outscore state and national averages by a sizable margin. And just the one thing to note, particularly for community members, that you can see when the scale changed on the SAT. So most of us around the room, when we took the SAT, there were 2 parts to the SAT. The SAT a number of years ago went to 3 parts, and it went back to 2 parts starting last year. So that's the reason for the scale change. But we continue to perform quite a bit higher than the national and state averages. And as a general indicator of college readiness, you can use from the SAT that essentially a 1,000 score on the SAT, which is not a high score on the SAT, but a 1,000 score gives you about a 70% or a 75% chance of getting a C or better in your freshman courses. So that's kind of the correlation that the SAT is used to develop for an indicator of college readiness. So you can see that we're quite a bit above that in Fairfax at almost 1,200. This chart is related to the same outcome, but it depicts the ACT. Again, we're scoring much higher than the state and national averages. And the ACT benchmark for college readiness is somewhere between a 22 or a 23 score on the ACT would provide a 75% chance of getting a C or better in freshman classes. So again, at 26, we're quite a ways above that college readiness indicator. This chart you've seen before. It depicts our scores on the Pisa exam in relation to other countries and the United States average. So again, you can see the FCPS average in blue, highlighted above the United States average, the OECD average, and quite near the top of individual country averages. And when we look at our scores by school in Fairfax, we have schools that are right there at the very top. But as a school system, our performance is still very high in comparison.
Sloan, this is just another one. I just want to say as superintendent and coming in that we need to hit more and more. This sample that took this is a random sample of our kids?
That's correct.
And our average of our kids is 5 points behind Finland, that used to be the top country on international tests like 3 years ago. Hong Kong, we're 7 points from in reading. In math, Hong Kong, we're 48.9. Sorry, my math. Singapore, okay, 20 points. I mean, our average kid is outperforming most of the world and is on the heels of the countries who've got the best test scores in the world. That's huge.
In countries where the test takers are very homogeneous as well, right? Where you don't see as many English learners as you do in our population in this data set. So again, I'm going to keep us moving ahead if possible. And the next desired outcome in strategy 1 is that teachers, students, and parents are going to have access to contemporary and effective technology resources. We looked at this a little bit on Thursday night. And, I would just reiterate again that in 2018, we think it's incredibly important that all of our students have access to technology resources in order to be able to promote equitable learning outcomes. So in the question period, we can certainly dig into the data a little bit more, but this information is derived by parents responding to our questions when they enroll their students at the beginning of the year on the parent care card. So you can see that we still have quite a few parents and students that do not have access to adequate technology or internet access at home. And of course, FCPS On is the division's major initiative that we're working on to address that gap in access. We've got community meetings that are being conducted in each region around the school system right now. We've already conducted 3 of those. We have 2 more to go. And we're also in year 2 of our Johns Hopkins University evaluation report. And we will be bringing the information from both the community meetings and the evaluation report to the board soon, probably sometime late spring, early summer perhaps, based on the board's schedule. Now, the next outcome is around all students demonstrating digital citizenship. And this, of course, is a very important issue in society and in our schools. And it's one of these areas where we can always do better, but we think that it's an area where we've made a lot of growth over the last several years. We use what's called a shared responsibility model, where we work to look at the things that are in our control in the classroom, things that teachers can do, things that students can do, and then things that parents can do with their students at home. And we've been using a curriculum framework, adopting the curriculum resources and materials from Common Sense Media around our work around digital citizenship. So that framework includes things like a focus on internet safety, a focus on communication, relationships online, i.e. cyberbullying types of issues, self-image and identity, privacy and security, of course, digital footprint, which is incredibly important, and things like information literacy. So just a few of the highlights from last year, starting kind of on the left-hand side and going clockwise. We have new training materials that we put in place for our teachers, which are much more stringent and elaborate and rigorous than the training that we had provided before, because our training, frankly, needed to be updated based on trends in society. With our parents, we've created modules that parents can use with their students at home to talk about these particular issues and help, set good, hopefully good decision-making processes in place in the home. We also have parent nights that run at our schools where parents can get more information about how to support their students with digital citizenship. And then at the student level, we will be requiring in school year 18-19 required lessons in every grade level around digital citizenship, and that was something this board and Ms. Schultz in particular said that we really needed to do, and we agreed, so that's going to be in place in 18-19. And then we have a lot of school-based activities that many of you might have seen schools participating in your districts. Digital Citizenship Week is a big time when there's a lot of focus on this particular issue, and some of our schools are going really kind of above and beyond what our division expectations have been and working towards essentially a credentialing, if you will, that's available from Common Sense Media when they're really, really focused on embedding this as part of the culture and the priorities around their school. So we have a number of schools that are doing that. So now we're going to move to Strategy 2. Remember, there's 4 strategies in Goal 1, and Strategy 2 is really looking at our use of assessment and data systems to drive effective decision-making, particularly around Portrait of a Graduate. So the desired outcomes here is the development of a balanced assessment system, that data tools will be available to all schools, and that grading is an accurate reflection of learning. And I think we actually talked about all 3 of these desired outcomes in the SOA presentation. So again, I think the timing is appropriate. So some of the highlights here, over the past year, we've really increased our use of performance-based assessments for measuring content knowledge and Portrait of a Graduate skills. We've expanded a pilot of what's called a capstone experience, which we'll talk a little bit about today, and we've increased the availability of effective data tools. Now, some of our challenges, though, continue to be, as we talked about in the SOA presentation, the need for additional state flexibility around what we can be responsible for at the local level in terms of accountability and what the state or the federal government would be responsible for in terms of accountability. So we will continue to advocate for the use of more performance-based assessments for accountability purposes. And then we, of course, always need to get better at data literacy. The more data that's available to teachers, the more teachers need to be effective at understanding how to use that data to make instructional decisions. But we have a role in central office to help them with that and to make their work more efficient so that they're not spending time trying to figure things out that we could really support them with and save them valuable time. So the first desired outcome is around a fully balanced assessment system that reflects Portrait of a Graduate in all content areas. And again, like many of these desired outcomes, we could talk about this one in length, but I just put one slide together on our capstone pilot program, which I think exemplifies our work around balanced assessment. And I know that Ms. Hines couldn't be here. She's working today. But she had asked at the board meeting, what are we doing to use different kinds of assessments, things that aren't as standardized? And how are we thinking about assessment that's not for external accountability purposes? And over the weekend, I was actually at a conference. I had the opportunity to present at a conference, the American Education Research Association conference, which is a huge conference. And I was on a panel. It's kind of funny because I was on a panel. I was the only person on the panel who wasn't promoting their recent book. So And I was the person that the audience was asking all the questions. And one of my fellow panelists finally said to the audience, well, you keep asking Sloan how you do these things in practice in Fairfax. Doesn't anybody want to ask me how I do these things in theory? It's like, no, nobody wants to know how you do these in theory. How do you do them in practice, right? So we're trying to do this in practice. And there's a lot of interest in the field, in the work that we're doing. So our capstone pilot is really trying to bring our work around portrait of a graduate skills together, our work around performance-based assessment, and our work around deep understanding and conceptual learning in the curriculum together. So what this slide represents is it represents a continuum of experiences that start in the early elementary grade bands and go all the way through high school, where we focus on particular portrait of a graduate attributes that are illustrated on this slide, and where we focus on really important concepts. And we're really focused on this concept where students can think deeply over time, and longitudinally we can see how their work continues to grow. So we can start in the early grades really focusing with our students on thinking about issues of community and relationships. What does that mean? What does that look like? Moving into middle school and adolescent development, really thinking about individual personal identity. Into high school, making sure that our students are thinking about multiple perspectives and understanding other people's views and beliefs. And then finally, in the 11th and 12th grade, thinking about their individual contributions to society. And following that thematic progression, if you will, we're able to dig deep into some of these portrait of a graduate skills, use some of our assessment practices like our rubrics, where students self-assess themselves in their portrait of a graduate attributes, use some of our performance-based measures where students are doing research and presenting their research and presentations of learning and exhibitions of learning when we get to the 11th and 12th grade level. And you might recall in the video that we showed on Thursday evening, some of the students were talking about those experiences. A couple students that we interviewed talked about how dramatic these kinds of experiences have been in terms of helping them think about what they're most interested in studying, what their post-high school career and college goals might look like, and really helping them identify those interests and how engaged they were in the learning process. I think the thing that's so exciting is when you hear some of those students speak, they talk about assessment as a process and how that's different than testing, which is an event. And they don't get really excited to take an SOL test or an SAT test. They know that it kind of comes with the territory and we have to do those things. But they talk about assessment as a process where they set goals, they work to achieve those goals, they reflect on what they did well, their grows and their glows, they get feedback from teachers, and then they reestablish new goals and how that's really helped them deepen and extend their learning. So I think this work is really, really exciting, and we're doing this work in about 20 pilot schools right now, and we're going to continue to expand that work to more schools in the future. The next desired outcome is our work around data tools. I'm not going to say a lot about this other than to say that we continue in great partnership with many of the departments, DIT in particular, to take feedback from our teachers and refine the tools that we have available to them so the teachers have access to individual student data that they can use to make instructional decisions themselves and with their team members so that principals and instructional leaders understand grade level data, classroom data, and individual student data, and can make sure that their schools are providing the supports necessary both to students and to teachers to continue to improve performance, and that region leaders can look at by pyramid and by region, and we can use to support our continuous improvement work. So we continue to get a lot better in this area. One of our continual improvement processes is around our professional development and our training for teachers. The next outcome is around grading, being an accurate reflection of learning. And I'm not going to unpack these too much right now other than to say the charts that we're looking at here, this particular chart, is looking at the correlation between AP scores on the test and AP scores in the classroom. So your test score and your grade. And you can see when you read the chart, if you just read down the A- column, for example, students that received an A- in an AP course, again on average, 28% of those students got a 5 on the test, 30% of those students got a 4 on the test. So this really helps us dial in to that correlation between grades and achievement. We've created this in a more interactive format for our schools to use, so schools can look at this data by school, by course, and we have the same thing with our IB schools and our IB scores. So we'd be happy to talk about that in more detail if there are questions as well. Strategy 3 is next, and this is providing early childhood experiences for more students in our school system. And the desired outcomes here is to provide all qualifying, publicly funded future FCPS students would have access to high-quality preschool, and that all agencies, ourselves, the county, community service agencies, would really do a better job coordinating our efforts. So again, we've got a lot of great work that's happening here in terms of highlights. Students are participating in pre-K experiences. Those that do outperform, those that don't, excuse me, I'm very sorry. Got to take just a quick drink here, I apologize. Well, he was like 2 minutes in, I'm an hour in, so. Sorry about that. But students that participate in pre-K outperform those that don't. We see that in our data. We're going to dig into that in a second. We've increased the number of pre-K opportunities, like I mentioned earlier. We've increased access to professional development for early childhood community educators, right? So trying to increase the quality of community-based programs wherever we can. When we can't get the kids in our system, can we give community providers, professional development resources, ways to enhance those experiences outside of our system? And then some exciting work with the county on the county's equitable school readiness plan. But of course, challenges, we don't have all of our qualifying students in our programs. And of course, the neediest communities have higher numbers of students without preschool. So we looked at this chart on Thursday, this heat map, if you will, that identifies students entering kindergarten without preschool and where those percentages are highest throughout the county. And then I believe it was Ms. Corbett-Sanders that asked about kind of, again, the intersection or the overlay on that heat map with some additional demographic data, ethnicity data as well. So we've provided this. This is in the report. This information is provided for multiple years in the report. But just we'll take a second and kind of unpack this chart so that it makes sense to everybody because it's kind of complicated to read. So first of all, what we're looking at is students without pre-K experience. And you can see the distribution by ethnicity. So in that first chart, in the last column, for example, you see that in the fall of 2016, students entering kindergarten, 48% of those students with no pre-K experience were Hispanic or Latino. Okay? Then, when we follow the chart over to the right-hand side, we look at the intersection with poverty. Okay? And again, the last column, and it's highlighted in red, students without pre-K experience, or that didn't report it, because we do have some of those students in the data as well, 52% of our students that did not have pre-K experience would qualify for a fee waiver. So that's our free or reduced meals or economically disadvantaged students. Then if you follow that red group down and break that down a little bit more and say, out of those students who did not enter kindergarten with preschool, that also would qualify for a fee waiver, what does that look like in terms of a distribution by ethnicity? And you can see the disproportionality there for our Hispanic or Latino students. So we've created a number of these charts over the last several years in the attached narrative report. This chart looks at the longitudinal impact of pre-K on students' learning outcomes. We've got, again, a number of these charts in the report going back for several years. And just to take a second to unpack this chart, there are 3 different colored dots on this chart. The first dot is the blue dot, and that is all of our students in FCPS that did not participate in FCPS. So that means those are kids that maybe didn't have preschool, or maybe those are kids that had private preschool, right? So it's a real mixture of students in that demographic. The orange dot are students that did not have FCPS that were economically disadvantaged. Some of those kids we were looking at in that previous chart. And then the gray dot are students that participated in FCPS. And you need to be economically qualifying, first of all, to participate in FCPS. So these students do have economic disadvantage. And you can see that with those students outperform the orange dots longitudinally. And I just want to say that it's important, and this is on our DRA measure, so we're looking at reading here. It's important to look at longitudinal data, and we have a positive trend here, but there's an awful lot of things that happen in a kid's life and their educational experience from kindergarten and first grade to sixth grade or beyond. So we have to be a little bit careful to over-attribute things or under-attribute things when we're looking at a 5-year time frame with so many additional variables. But nevertheless, our longitudinal data still show a lasting impact for students that participated in our FCPS program. So areas of focus for early childhood, again, continuing to work with the county and community providers on the Equitable School Readiness Plan, continuing to try to find more ways to add more students to our preschool programs in Fairfax and in Fairfax County, working to expand services to families through our opportunity neighborhoods, and engaging additional community members and organizations to help increase the community's commitment to school readiness. The final strategy, strategy 4, is related to providing students with relevant opportunities to explore options and prepare for college and careers. The two desired outcomes here are, 1, a portfolio of school options to provide multiple pathways to a diploma, and finally, students being fluent in 2 or more languages. So a few highlights here. The expansion of our high school pathways work is underway. And it's including additional coursework leading to in-demand careers. We have increased our dual enrollment offerings. We can talk some about that. Increased resume-ready credentials, and increased work-based learning experiences for our students. We still have challenges around our accountability systems for college and career readiness indicators and around expansion of work-based learning opportunities. But we do have a lot, I think, of highlights to celebrate, and just a few specific highlights that I'd like to touch on. We've seen an increase of dual enrollment to include 228 sections of dual enrollment, 228 dual enrollment sections in our high schools during the 2017-18 school year. 74% of our students participating in work-based learning. Our work around the Edison Global STEM Challenges program, which is an interdisciplinary program based on a curriculum from the National Academy of Engineers. We've seen tremendous success with 100% of students passing state standardized assessments. We've seen expansion of partnerships and course offerings in cybersecurity. And we had more than 5,000 students in the class of 2017 taking academy courses prior to graduation. So we've seen a big increase in the number of students that are interested in taking academy courses. We've not been able to provide the staffing that we would like to support some of those student interests. And then looking ahead to some of our focus areas, we want to continue to expand our youth apprenticeship programs in our trade and industrial education. We're talking about trying to do some work with facilities department here in FCPS, expansion of HVAC, plumbing, electrical options, because there's big workforce demands and needs in those fields. Continuing to collaborate with the county government, NOVA, George Mason, community partners to expand our cybersecurity work and opportunities for students. We definitely want to continue to expand our dual enrollment courses and our health and medical programs as well. And one thing we actually have started conversations around recently, which would be exciting, is working with HR to try to put together an education pathway where we could do kind of a develop your own Teachers for Tomorrow program, because we know that we've got a lot of jobs that we'd like to fill, and we'd love to fill them with Fairfax County graduates. So the last indicator is around students becoming fluent in 2 or more languages. And when we look at the trend data, We do see positive trends in the growing number of students that have access to programs, world language programming. But as Mr. McElveen pointed out, we haven't seen the kind of growth that we would like to see in this area to really realize the desired outcome of all of our students being fluent in 2 or more languages. So that completes the formal presentation, and that was a bit longer than what I had promised our meeting managers, and I apologize for that, but I think we've preserved a decent amount of time for discussion. So I'd like to turn it back over to our meeting managers.
All right, thank you, Sloan, for that excellent presentation. I have 4 names on the list so far. Il Young, Elizabeth, Karen Corbett-Sanders, and Karen Keyes-Gamara. So with that, Il Young.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the presentation. And I had sent in some of the questions in advance. So I will focus on those questions first, and I might have a couple of additional questions. First of all, you touched upon the fact that there is an overlap between ELLs and FRM, and there's a 2/3 of overlap. So whether it is possible to have just 1/3 non-overlap portion of the students as a group of their scores. I want to see what the compounding impact of ELLs and FRM are on the student achievement. And also another question is not necessarily picking on any particular group, but it is a known fact that large part of our Hispanic students are ELLs. So if we could also touch upon, just for the Hispanic student group, that ELL and non-ELL, I mean, you said that about, graduation rate is 93% versus, 50-some%. But if you could also give us, test scores, math and English and language arts and, math will do. And for me, and also I think I had a brief conversation with Dr. Duran on Thursday night, whether we have a data regarding level of education on the part of parents versus FRM. Because I happen to believe that the level of education might have an impact upon how well the parents might be prepared to help, equipped to help their children's education. I'm asking that question from the angle that our school system has to do more in reaching out to those parents and help them be able to better help their children. And whether we are doing what we are doing, whether there is an area that we should and we could do better. And if we could share with what we are doing, what we are not doing because of maybe a financial constraint. If you could share those with us now, it's good. If not, if you could provide your response in writing, I could take that too.
Okay, so that's great. I appreciate the question. Let's start by actually pulling up the narrative report, if we could. And I'd like to draw the board's attention to some data that we've already put together that looks at the intersection of ethnicity and English language proficiency, that looks at ethnicity and special ed categorization. That may or may not get at all of your questions. So if you need additional correlation of additional variables, we can talk about that. But if we scroll down to page 113 in the narrative.
113.
And we'll pull that up here on the projector. And if we could make that just a little bit bigger. Well, a lot bigger, yes. So what we're looking at in this particular chart is our reading data that we were referring to earlier by economically disadvantaged and ethnicity. So here you can see for example, our Asian economically disadvantaged students and how they performed on the reading tests. So that's what this data is showing.
Okay.
So we provided that level of disaggregation. Then if we scroll to page 114, yeah, we're gonna go to Yeah, this section starts on page 114. We're going to go to page 114 now, and here we're looking at ethnicity and English learner status. Okay.
Could you enlarge that?
So again, we're seeing the pass rates by ethnicity and English learner status. So for example, in 2017, our Hispanic English learners pass rate on our reading test was 59%. Okay? On page 115, we're looking at the intersection of ethnicity and students with disabilities. So special ed status by ethnicity and the pass rates. So on that chart on page 115, for example, white students with disabilities pass rate on the reading test was 73% in 2017. And we've done the same thing for math. So I don't know if that's exactly what you were looking for, but that's starting to bring some of these variables together. If you'd like a different combination of variables, we'd be happy to work on that. Your second part of that question was around parent education level. And unfortunately, we don't have information in FCPS on our parent education level. What I can tell you in general is, though, and this is a generalization, that the education profession started really asking this question back in about 1965 with the publication of the Coleman Report. So James Coleman produced a report in the mid-'60s, and it really found strong correlations between parents' level of educational attainment and student outcomes. And national education policy actually responded pretty quickly to that report, and the Title I Act, where we provide additional funding for low-income families, was passed in 1968 and signed into law in 1968. Now, over the intervening years, we've come to realize that it's not just as simple as a parent's education status. What you have to do is you have to think about, well, what comes along with a parent's level of educational attainment? So there are things that come along with educational attainment that might be economically advantaged. So typically, obviously, the more education you have, the more income that you have. So you have the opportunity to provide more enrichment opportunities, more support opportunities for your family. But there's additionally things that might come along with parents' educational level that just relate to kind of values and how parents talk about education in the home, what kind of expectations they set for their students, things that they model for their students, either explicitly or implicitly. So there's a lot of kind of mitigating variables that go into this correlation between educational level and attainment. What I would say really to the third part of your question is, well, if we know and research says that there's a correlation, what are we doing about that? So I just mentioned a few things, and then anybody else that's up here at the table, certainly feel free to jump in as well. One of the things that we've tried to do is really to help parents work as educational partners, right? Sometimes if you don't have a high level of educational attainment and you didn't do well in school, there's lots of reasons why that might be the case, right? Maybe you weren't comfortable in school or welcomed in school, and maybe you don't feel comfortable in school. So we have to establish a trusting relationship with those families and make sure that we can empower them to be partners in the educational experience with their kids. And we need to start that work as early as possible. So we do a lot of work out of our Office of Family Engagement, and our coordinator is here today. We do a lot of that work in our Office of ESOL. We do a lot of that work in our early childhood office, starting as early as possible with programs like early literacy, starting with programs like HIPPY, home instruction for parents of preschool youth, family literacy activities. Those are all things that start to empower parents to think about how they can be effective in being advocates for their students. So we have a lot of those kinds of programs in place. We certainly have federal Title I dollars. We certainly have needs-based staffing. All of those types of activities are really directed at trying to mitigate the impact of poverty and things that we know about correlations with parents' educational attainment. So let me stop talking there and see what follow-up questions you have or things other people might want to
probably at least have at least one follow-up on that. First of all, I mean, within our financial constraint, I believe that our school system needs to do all that we can to help out these families, these parents, and these students who are basically, I think we have a moral obligation to level the playing field. That's where I am coming from. And the one example of hippies, the programs are generally provided during the day or evening on a weekday as opposed to weekends. And many of these families parents may be working 2 jobs and they just cannot come during the day or even the evening. And the weekend may be the only time they can do, but we don't do that. And a few years ago, when I presented a budget amendment, that I heard from my parents that there are more parents out there wanting to access this service. Obviously, we're talking about money, which is finite. But I think as one board member, having at least what we could be doing more and give us an opportunity as a board to consider those and pick and make some decisions on. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what I'm asking you to.
Yeah, I think that's
to provide.
Yeah, I think that's a very important discussion. That might be a next step that you would like something in writing. I mean, just again, this topic alone could be its own work session at least, right? But we totally agree with you from a staff point of view that we'd like to be able to do more around parent empowerment and parent engagement. There's all kinds of things that we could do differently and do better. In addition, on the parent piece, though, I mean, there's things, direct services to students. Right. So, again, the board's advocacy in the past around expanding the number of slots for preschool education, that continues to be a priority to try to put supports in place to mitigate the effects of poverty. Things like thinking about how we might be able to extend the school day with after-school enrichment activities that are meaningful for students. Thinking about how we might be able to extend the academic year with meaningful programming during the summer. I mean, there's all kinds of things. And to your point, the policy discussion about what to choose and what to do.
I'm not going to disagree with you on those points. Those are all very important. But I still believe family and parents play a very vital role in educating children. And we need to do all that we can to empower and equip these parents to best help their children.
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about it. That is one of our main drivers in our Closing the Achievement Gap framework. So, again, we'd be happy, I mean, if you want to have that as a next step, to provide some things in writing.
Thank you.
Sure.
And one small additional question related to something else. This is academies. High school academies. Earlier you mentioned that there's a growing need for academic programs.
Yes.
But we limit the academies to, first of all, juniors and seniors, correct? Some of the programs provided at the academies, if freshmen and sophomore want to have access to, by design, we don't let them do it. So whether there's a way to find out whether there's a need even for freshmen and sophomore to access those programs, that's one. Second, that with the growing needs, if there's a limitation in the staffing, how many students are we turning away from these programmatic opportunities? There's some information that I would like to have. And how many more staffings we may need to meet the needs of those students.
Yeah, I appreciate that question as well. We'd be happy to give you the exact number in writing, but roughly what we saw this year with our work around enrollment and staffing for next school year, 18-19, is that we had several hundred students that we had to turn away. We had about 13 full-time staff members, right, that we could have hired based on student interest. Now, we don't always staff everything that students want to take at our comprehensive-based schools either, so I understand that you're not going to get everything. But I give you that figure just to indicate that we have not increased our staffing in academies as a school system really in the last 10 years, and we are seeing an additional interest in more career-related pathways. It's one of the board's goals around high school pathways and flexibility for graduation requirements and workforce readiness and college readiness. So I think it's another one of those conversations that we need to think about how we might best, again, with finite resources, be able to create more staffing and more opportunities for increased academy enrollment.
Thank you. I have a few other questions, but I'm going to send those in writing.
Okay, thank you.
offline.
Thank you, Mr. Moon. Ms. Schultz?
Okay, and normally I go from the beginning of the presentation, but I'll start here because I can piggyback off of Mr. Moon's. I do want to make the point that, first of all, this is so important. I mean, if I could travel back in time, I would tell you all then, this is what you need to be doing then. This is helpful because this starts to drill down to where is it that the resources need to go? Instead of staffing levels that are just a formula for everywhere, the question is, where is the issue? But the one thing that I will bring up with this, and beggars can't be choosers, in that we've gotten this information, but the disparity of what type of disability we're talking about, whether you have, with disabilities, a student who has Asperger's or autism, who is nonverbal, is a student with disabilities. A student who has profound medical needs is a student with disabilities. A student who has dyslexia is a student with disabilities. They're not all equal. And I don't know that this, even as good as this is, that it's not intuitive enough to disaggregate, a high-functioning student who has accommodations in the classroom versus somebody who, is in a, self-contained.
So you did ask last year for some of that additional data, and we've tried to provide some of that here. So what I'd like to do is go to page 119. And again, there's so much information here. It takes, an inordinate amount of time to find it and locate it and talk about all of it. So I didn't really go down to this level, obviously, in my presentation of disaggregation, but we've tried to provide some of that information here.
Okay, we only had like 1,000 pages to read for this work session, so if I missed this one slide, this one back, that's good, and I can get into that later. Yeah. But this now you talk about the functional use of our operational dollars, Dr. Brabrand, and how you direct those dollars in a meaningful way. And that's what I was trying to get to earlier about the chronic absenteeism, is we don't have chronic absenteeism. There may be some places in some schools with certain populations that we have chronic absenteeism. So now you've pared down as a focal point how you direct resources exactly where you need them and no place else for that particular problem. So I'm glad we don't need to go into further detail here. Can we go back? I do want to go back to the beginning. Can we go to slide 5? I have a question about the biliteracy seal. Do you know how many of those earning a biliteracy seal were already ELL to begin with? So I hate to tell
we have not disaggregated by literacy, but we certainly can.
So I have a sneaking suspicion, I hate to tell you, that a vast majority of those 25% are actually former ELL, so that they came in with a language and we taught them English. And I don't necessarily think that that was the goal on the biliteracy seal, and I think it could potentially be a next step for us to understand how effective we really are with a world language, goal of creating, So that's a for someone else. I already covered my slide 10. If we can go to slide 28, which is on the internet access. I just want to try to understand under the column no. So you have internet home access, no, in terms of having home access. And then below it, you have adequate computer access. And it's over 1662 difference between the two. But it's fewer in terms of adequate computer access. So how could you have people who have adequate computer access but don't have internet? I don't understand the disparity between those two.
They may be in one of our one-to-one locations that has been given a device and they haven't necessarily checked out a MiFi. Would be an example.
Okay.
I think that's definitely true. Another thing I would point out, and this is one of the main reasons that I wanted to share this data set, is how many families didn't even reply. So we don't even know. Right?
Well, on any kind of a survey, I mean, when you look at actually the replies, that's actually a massive set of replies. So statistically, you can bear out those averages. But my question is, though, even though that's number of students, is that families? Because that looks like an awful lot to not be duplicate students within families based on what our ratios of number of students to a family. And
The data comes from emergency care cards, which is 1 per student.
right. So what I'm saying is that, again, statistically, that doesn't say that there's 9,456 households without internet access. And that becomes very imperative when we talk about how we're defining where to spend our resources and quantifying the magnitude of the problem. That isn't households, that's numbers of children. So I think it's more accurate for us to determine the number of households in order to understand the scale of the problem. You see what I'm saying? Okay, so I don't need to go into that one. Can we go to slide 29, the next slide? Boy, I wrote, there are very easy ways to put a smile on my face. The fact that we're getting to digital citizenship is so important. The degree of bullying and prurient things that are happening on the internet and with the students is still very, very high. And I want to be very, very cautious as we continue this discussion on one-to-one is what is the trend here? In particular, and this may be a little sensitive and you may not be able to answer it, but on the left, since you called it out, is the PD for teachers. Are we continuing to strengthen the discussion around communications between teachers and students on social media?
That shouldn't be happening.
Yes, and we just did a revision of information to our employees around good social media guidelines. I can put that in the BB again just to refresh it for the board. We put it out about a month or two ago. Highly visual, small slides, but a real clarity for our employees. And we need to continue. We need to push it every year, not make it a one-time, oh, check the box, we've done it, because it continues to come up in our school system.
Okay. I mean, I do think that's significant, and there's a new, and I've mentioned this offline, there's a new organization called the Center for Humane Technology that has been largely populated by former Silicon Valley giant tech executives, and it is talking about the realization that potentially some of the stuff that's happening in social media and happening in the digital world is harmful to society and to having a humane existence. And I will be giving you the executive director of that's information, because I think that's the flip side. I think to have a balanced understanding of what this means is not only the digital citizenship, but how much digital exposure our students need. Can I go to slide 30? And on that same vein, the question is of the data, that middle bullet, the data tools that will be available, who has this individual student data? What is the repository for this in terms of the protection of individual student data? How frankly, a little bit manic are we being with the cyber protection of individuals? I mean, this is a huge, huge concern as we see even in congressional hearings, as the protection of privacy data related to students.
Let's let Mary Beth answer that question.
Every year, we actually do an audit of our student access to our student information, and we make every single principal and every single program manager confirm that the people that have access still need to have that access. They update us whenever there's a change, but we also do an annual audit and require that they review both the level and what access anybody in their staff that has access.
Who's the repository of it? Is that proprietary that we hold it, or is that a vendor?
We hold the data in terms, yes, that's maintained by FCPS in terms of it's both human resources and student, so our Lawson system and our student information system. We actually go through that, and the EDSL system. We make everybody confirm that who has rights, do they still have the rights, do they still have the need to know annually. Yep. And we maintain that.
Okay. And then can I go to 30, glance past 34, but then go on to 38. So 34 and then go to 38. Those two combinations of data sets are something that we've been striving for a very long time. And you talked earlier about watching how savvy our students become with data, and that this is sort of, this is part of Portrait of a Graduate and project-based learning. My question is, what are you all doing as staff to basically hold yourselves accountable to be able to produce, because this becomes meaningful. I mean, I had a colleague who says he wants to frame this, and put this on the wall. 5.5 years it took to get to this. It shouldn't take that. And the ability of you to provide data in context for us and to visualize that data allows us as a board to make better policy. We're better informed for the mere fact of having this and the other data, because now, I don't think he's here anymore. Mr. Greenfelder isn't here, but driving the limited resources, and they're going to be, bless Mr. Hill and his, we're going to get this budget the way it is, but, oh, by the way, strap in, because it's not going to be this way going forward. We're going to have to make decisions. That is the way in which we can make decisions in a more meaningful, priority-driven, data in context, pros and cons. Look, you can decide to do X, Y, and Z, but, oh, by the way, you have, A through X that you also need to do. You need to make choices. This allows us to make choices. So how is staff pursuing analytical understanding of the information in a way that you can provide it better to us as a board? I know that that's out of the context of this, but it's very, very important.
I think it's a really good question. I mean, I think there's a number of different ways, a few things that I would illustrate. I mean, first I would just say we really, and I really believe this, honestly. I've worked in other school systems and I've worked in other professions. We've got the smartest people in this organization. We can produce the kind of information that the board needs to help you make decisions. I mean, we can do that. We try to do that in instructional services. We talk about that all the time. It's like, what are we doing to help the board? Sometimes, though, I just think, like, there's so much and we kind of miss it. And the more we can have these conversations where you can tell us what would be more helpful, then I think we can produce it and we can get better through these kinds of conversations. I think this report has gotten better because of these conversations in the last couple of years. As a system as a whole, I think we're doing a lot around thinking about data in different ways. When Dr. Duran came here, one of the first things he did is help establish a collaborative group, which is called our Division Data Collaboration Team, where IT and IS and Mark's team and special ed and professional learning, OST, the regions are all working together to try to improve our data analysis and our data visualization. And we've made big gains. Instructional Services for the last going on 4 years now has been working with the Carnegie Foundation for the advancement of teaching and learning around measurement literacy and getting better with measurement and analysis. So we're continuing to learn and get better. But I think we could do better together if we just have these collaborative conversations about what questions do you want answered and what data do you need, and we can, I think, do a better job of meeting those needs.
I'm going to pose, and this has just come to me, although I remember having this conversation with somebody on LT before this. I'm going to pose that we should consider, as a board and with LT, potentially cross-pollinating our PD, because I think of some of the things that we've been exposed to at NSBA and some of that type of professional development that's happening that takes us outside of ourselves. And I'm certain, I'm hearing about conferences that Dr. Presidio goes to visit. I think we only become better potentially if we we cross-pollinate that. And maybe we should take 1 or 2 LT or 3 LT members with us to NSBA, and they should be inviting maybe some of us along with them, because there is a specific breakout that happened that was a executive director of a state school board association, a superintendent, a board member, and the senior business executive of 4 different states, different school systems, different sizes, and they talked specifically about this. Can you go back to 34? About how important the understanding of staff was of their data, but the ability to communicate that to the board is what moved a division forward, or moved strategic plan forward, or addressed specific goals, whether it's minority student achievement or economic disadvantage, meeting the needs of those. That's a significant potential, I think, that we ought to continue exploring. So I'm going to leave that with the idea that I do think that academic year length in certain areas on pilot programs could potentially be the differentiator for the subgroup population issues that we need to make demonstrative improvement on. So thank you.
So Ms. Schultz, real quick, because I will want to ask the rest of my colleagues, when your turn comes, when you're done asking your questions, one of the things we talked about Thursday that I had mentioned to all of you is we really do want to understand where are the areas within this Goal 1 report that you would like to see a deeper dive, because there's no way a 2-hour work session, when we spent 4 hours last year alone, we're going to get to this. And in a 150-page report, yes, 45 minutes goes to a presentation. So Dr. Brabrand, you basically have a board of 12 that will give you about an hour's worth of a dialogue on what's probably the most important work we're supposed to be involved in. And when we talked to Dr. Presidio, we knew that we weren't going to be able to do it today. And this always should have been seen as a part 1 and part 2. So Ms. Schultz, if there's areas, whether you're prepared to answer that now, but when we go to next steps, definitely, we need to kind of get some sort of consensus on where are the areas that we want to, come back and have sort of a deeper dive part 2 on this work session.
It absolutely is going to be around the special the slide 115, the special education, and the other slide, the one that you went to after that, because that's our persistent Achilles heel. So if around the academic achievement gap and the disaggregated academic achievement gap, and not only the disaggregated achievement gap, but where? By school. I mean, I've gone to presentations where they show the academic achievement by student, by school, I mean, not by individual student, by student groups, so that they understand where the resources have to go.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ms. Schultz. All right, I have on tap Ms. Karen Corbett-Sanders, followed by Karen Keyes-Gamarra, and then Janie Strauss.
Okay, thank you. And I would echo much of what my colleague has said. We could go deep on a number of different issues in this presentation. I do thank you very much, not only for the presentation, but the actual document has a lot of meat in it, and the appendix in particular. I skimmed through it. I will be going deeper and looking at it in more detail, I'm sure, over the next few months, because it also has a lot of good resource data for having conversations with the community. Now, having said that, if we can go to slide number 32, capstone pilot. And when I checked on which schools that have the capstone pilot, I don't think it's necessarily geographically dispersed across the county. And the one in our area was an AAP center, which is important. But I would urge that when we look at capstone pilots and when we look at problem-based learning, that we really do that in a more equitable way. So I would like to have your next steps on the capstone pilot and how we're going to expand it along with a more equitable lens. I had the opportunity to be at the George Mason University last week with the environmental showcase. It was wonderful, but I was sorely disappointed that there wasn't a single school that was east of 95 or south of the Mixing Bowl represented at that. And so as somebody who represents east of 95 and south, it is a bit disconcerting that I did not see many of our schools, actually any of our schools represented. And so when we look at problem-based learning, I would like to have that brought into your thought process when you start trialing things. Now on to page 34, slide 34. It's really important chart, and I was so glad that you mentioned that you have shared this data on a school-by-school basis with each of the principals. I would appreciate it if the regional assistant superintendents would have a conversation with at a minimum, the magisterial members, but I would actually say with each of the at-larges as well, how this looks on a school-by-school basis in a regional manner. Does that make sense? Because then we can have a more in-depth conversation regarding it. Then if we can go to, on page 46 in the report, and I forgot to note the slide, but you indicate that we expect 3 schools not to be fully accredited for 2018-2019. Can you share with us what schools those are?
Again, it's just a prediction, as we talked about during the SOA presentation, and we can look at the more detailed predictive kind of analytics with individual board members if you're interested. But right now we would be predicting probably, or I should say perhaps, Whitman, Glasgow, and Mount Vernon Woods Elementary School.
Okay. When charts like this are put together, it would be really helpful if you would share that data with the magisterial member at a minimum so that we know what you're talking about on them. Mm-hmm. That'd be great. Slide 36. No, it's the heat map. I'm sorry for pre-K. I must have put the wrong slide number down. There, 38, I'm sorry. Fantastic, as many of my colleagues have noted. What would be very helpful here is a couple of different things. One is a plan of action to get rid of that dark color in those regions. And so if we could have a strategic plan or at least a laid out plan of how we plan on addressing this, which would include not only Fairfax County resources, but also greater outreach to the faith-based community, which has addressed much of this in the past. And then also along those lines, you talk about professional development for the pre-K providers, because we've talked about this in the past. Each of these models is very different, and although there is professional development, I would like to better understand how we ensure that the professional development is not just a magic wand of a few hours, and that we have a continuous process of infusing more and more professional development, especially for the in-home daycare providers. So as a next step, if we could have a fuller plan on how we want to address, how you would recommend us addressing this shortfall, that'd be great. And then on the biliteracy seal, it would, if you can come back to us with unpacking that a bit more, as Mrs. Schultz had mentioned. Yep. Then just 2 additional pieces. One is the promotion of CTE and how many of our students actually take advantage of CTE. It would be really helpful. I spend a lot of time in the community, and I talk to community members about CTE and the opportunities in our academies. And so many of the people don't even know a whole lot about it. So if we could have more of a communications plan, almost a promotion of CTE and academy programs beyond, because I hear from parents, well, my child asked about it and they were told by their counselor that it really doesn't fit into their schedule because they're getting an advanced diploma. And I don't think we want to have that message out there.
Well, I'm just trying to think how much to get into this because I know that you've got another work session. So we can respond back to that, certainly in writing. Again, I want to remind the board there's different ways for us to collaborate on some of these things too, right? So next steps are one, but we can also have individual conversations if you want to go a little bit deeper in a topic. If there's something that's really of interest to you, we're happy to meet with individual board members and kind of work through some of the questions as well.
Well, to our meeting managers, I think this is one where it's really important that, because we have such a short amount of time today, it's kind of like spaghetti on the wall. We're throwing out areas that I think are important.
Yeah.
And when we go through the next steps, if there is greater interest than just one or two of us, then that would be where I would think we'd want to come back and have a fuller discussion with the full board. Does that make sense?
It does. I do want to continue to make the offer, though, because some board members take me up on it and some don't. And it's fine. I understand if it doesn't work for you. But sometimes an answer to a next step might not really answer your question. So if you really feel like, there's a lot that it's kind of hard to articulate and a lot to unpack, definitely just let us know and we'll set up a time to meet individually with somebody and kind of work through a lot of those questions.
That's fantastic. And then my last comment is on family engagement and actually empowering families initially, but then as our kids get older, empowering them to take ownership of their education. And I'm going to go back to, because this heat map kind of leads to where there may be challenges for family engagement, that we have a fuller plan which also includes, and this addresses some of, I'm going to piggyback on Mr. Moon's comment about availability of programming during the time when families are available, that I think we should be partnering more with our faith-based community. We have something called VIC in Mount Vernon, and those are all of our faith-based community, and they, if we reach out to them and say, hey, we need your help on educating communities on this or that, they really step up to the plate on it, and they actually meet once a month to coordinate the activities to see how they can best reach the needs of our families that have the highest needs. So when we talk about our planning, I know we typically look at our budgeting and our process to include just those resources we fully control, but we should also look at those strategic partnerships.
That's good. Thank you.
That's it. Thank you.
So, Ms. Corbett-Sanders, is there any area in particular that you want me to add to this list of deeper dive? I agree with you. When we look at the next steps, those questions might help shape that. But is there anything that comes to mind specifically that you would like to see a follow-up deeper dive on?
Well, I think
that you think that's beneficial to the full board, not your own curiosity.
I don't think any. I think the most important is really taking a deeper dive on how we can eliminate this preschool gap. Okay. And a deeper dive on how we ensure that when we look at new opportunities such as problem-based learning, that we do it in a way that addresses or taps into some of those communities that have been underserved. And then the third piece is when we talk about opportunities and opportunity gaps, a big part of it is making sure that we address, we actually fully communicate the opportunities available through our CTE and academy programs.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, I have Ms. Karen Keys-Kamara, followed by Janie Strauss, followed by Tammy Dernack-Kofax. It is now 3:50. We were 30 minutes behind going into lunch. If we have the 8 of us or the 7 of us remaining who we're going to ask questions, try to do this in the next 25 minutes. You're really only looking at about 4 minutes a board member to try and ask your questions. You all know my attitude, which is it's how do we get a quality discussion done so we're in better positioned, but I wanted people be mindful of what time we're looking at here.
Okay, well, I would like to divide the time in the beginning so that everybody shares the same amount of time, but okay, we can discuss that later.
Well, no, Ms. Keys-Kumar, I want to reassure you, especially for those who've served with me for 6 years, you ask what you need to be asked.
Okay,
I'm not cutting
good.
people off. I just was kind of framing it out, but
That's fine.
you got to do.
I'll do the best I can. I try my best to shoot straight. That's my.
Can I add in shooting straight? Let me just tell you all something. We can do this meeting at every single work session you want, and I'm going to high five you. I don't want to talk about budget every work session. I want to talk about this stuff.
That's right.
So you and all, we can start working together to change the nature of the stuff you all want to talk about. This is what these guys live for and work 24 hours a day.
I know.
So I am all good. And maybe we should have never had it for a 2 hour. That just set it up to be too short. But we can come back, pick your top topics, and start to do 5 work sessions over the next 5 months. And we'll love every minute of it. So I just want you to know, I mean,
It's fine. It's
feel
good.
like we'll take this and follow up, and this is good stuff. The data is better, isn't it? It's getting better, and our strategies are going to get better, and when we have the strategic plan back to you, we're going to be rocking and rolling so fast, you're going to jump up and down, and I'm done talking.
This is the good stuff, and as I was going through this, I thought, I wish I had it on paper. I just got it, so I don't have all my pages, but hopefully we'll figure it out. I'm going to give you a precursor. Much of my conversation is going to focus on equity and communication. Those are the 2 areas where I personally feel is my focus is, and that's what this data draws me to. And I'd like to start with a quote. It's on page 59 in one of these things you gave us. Where it says FCPS and OFC found an inequitable distribution of publicly funded programs which negatively impacts kindergarten literacy. That kind of sums it up for me, because we looked at the preschools, we looked at that heat map, and the fact of the matter is, even if we look at, and this isn't FCPS's fault, this is not a statement of fault, it's a statement of fact. Even with respect to public funds, there's been an inequity. And so my question is, how do we move with all deliberate speed, following Mr. Moon's lead? I thought, as I read through it, by all means necessary to correct some of those problems. One of the ways that I thought about it is that the fact of the matter is, I think I read we had 600-something children added since 2012 to our publicly funded preschool program since 2012. I bet if we went to the hospital to see how many babies were born who fit in this category, the numbers would not match up very well. And so what that says to me is we may need to think outside of the box in terms of our delivery. And so I'd love to have a discussion. I know you referred to it with respect to some things going on, and I'll admit I probably don't know what all of those things are. I would love to know what they are, but I would also love to see discussion on, how we use our libraries, how we use our social media, how we use Channel 21 and beyond, because I don't think we have a lot of people looking at that station. But we have to find other ways to reach our kids, because we know this, that when we bring them up to, whether it's language proficiency or anything else, they do perform. So this, to me, is one of the number one things that I have to deal with, that I feel is important, because there is a built-in inequity, even in how we have offered services to our own citizens. And I can only say that's a shame. Okay. Then I did look in the appendix. I was looking on page 123 with respect to advanced academic programs. Students eligible 2013 to 17 for level 4 services. And it breaks it down by, thank you very much, by demographics, by race. The number of students, Asian, I believe, is 33%. Black, 6%. Hispanic, 9%. And so 45% of our white students and 8% other. So one of the things that I have seen in all of my reading is that when there's a subjective element to selecting these students, and I'm wondering if we have any plans of moving away from the subjective to the more objective ways of choosing students, because I think that at least the studies that I have seen says that those numbers change when you move away from that particular type of selection process.
So I know that we don't have a lot of time, so I'm trying not to respond to all these questions, but I do want to respond to this one because I think this is an area where there continues to be misunderstanding on the part of the community. We have a holistic process for identifying students, right? And first, let me say, we have a large disparity here in terms of our representation. We know that. We've talked about that a number of times as a board, and it's something that we definitely recognize as an area that we need to improve on. But in terms of the selection and admission process for advanced academics, it's a holistic process that has objective tests.
Mm-hmm. I understand that.
Right? And subjective information that teachers and families and students can submit. So work samples, letters of recommendation, right? Those types of pieces of information. We have a gifted behavior rating scale that we've used to try to identify students that might not be performing on the test, but are demonstrating similar characteristics in the classroom. And all of those additional pieces are a lot of what's helping us with the disparity in our numbers. If we just look at objective test scores, these numbers would look worse than they look now.
Well, I think, at least the article I was reading had more to do with getting outside testing as opposed to the...
We use an outside test now.
No. What is the appeal process? What is what? Thank you. So anyway.
Well, there's always things we can do to improve our system. I don't want to give the board or the community that impression at all, but I did want to kind of address this idea that, you know, we're using a subjective system. We're using a balanced system.
I understand it's not purely subjective, but there is a lot of, I've advocated for a lot of kids, and I understand that those comments from staff and that sort of thing contribute to whether a child is selected or not. And those comments, quite frankly, may fall into some of those categories. And I understand there may be people, advocating and trying to help folks, but there may also be some things that we're not aware of that are showing up in our numbers, and that's what I'm referring to. So I'm aware of the NANET tests and whatever. Am I using the right acronyms?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Et cetera. I'm aware of that. But I do know, I just feel, and even from my own personal experience as well as children that I've advocated for, we're leaving some folks behind, and I'm not sure that they shouldn't be on this particular train. Okay. Sure. Now, another concern I have, there were numbers in here with respect to lower SOL pass rates. And when I look at the groups that have the lower SOL pass rates, they're also the same groups that oftentimes receive higher suspension rates, higher discipline, etc. And so I know that we have some cultural competency and that sort of thing, and how are we looking at that in terms of its effectiveness and possibly improving what we offer?
So just real briefly, we're going to be addressing some of our work around cultural proficiency work in Goal 2, the Caring Culture Report, which is going to come to the board, I think, next month. So we'll get into more of that information there. But there's a big intersection between Goal 1, student success, and Goal 2, caring culture, for sure.
Sure.
And we also, as a result of the equity plan conversation, we heard loud and clear the prioritization from this board around discipline and advanced academic programs. So we are going to be bringing those back to work sessions to dig a little deeper into what is currently happening. Are there some misnomers or some misunderstandings? What are the realities? And what can we actually do to make a difference? So those are the two topics you're actually asking about are some that we have on the horizon to come dig into a much more detailed conversation and have actually even more people around this table who are really expert in working on those areas.
So for just following up on what you said, Dr. Duran, will that also include an actual plan or at least briefing us on how we're going to change these numbers that I just referred to on page 123 with respect to the advanced placement programs?
Yes, it will be not the initial one, because this is a process in terms of digging into, as you recall on the last part of the equity plan is that we really have to analyze. So that's the first piece. Then we really need to understand and then make some recommendations. So ultimately the planning piece will come in the third phase of that work that we're going to be engaged with the board over the next year. We've said that there are 17 different areas. We're not going to address all 17. So what are the prioritization of those areas? And those are the two that rose to the top with regards to discipline and advanced academic and ultimately having a plan for recommendations.
And I don't know if this is consistent with what you just stated, but I would love to see a plan with respect to how we're going to expand and improve, embellish our communications with our partnering parents. I mean, I have to say, in my advocacy work, how many times I have spoken to parents who have felt that their children were not achieving and really felt very helpless. You talk to them about simple things like going to the library, reading every night. It is for some parents, that is not a part of their regular culture. And so it seems to me, and it may not be the job of, it is not solely our job, but certainly we have a part in getting that information across, even if we partner with our hospitals so that when they take that baby home, they have a book in their hand. I mean, I just cannot emphasize, I do not care how we get it done. It has to happen. And you want to say something?
I just think there is more signaling that we can do both as a school system and with our community partners to reinforce. One of the things equity is going to do is, one of the things you've heard Francisco say is culturally responsive instruction. We need to scale that even more. You already saw the data, even economically disadvantaged. Sure. There's differences even among our economically disadvantaged. Some kids, that's not the barrier that it is for others. We got to go another layer. Right. What's stopping those other kids, and then identify things that we can help support. I do have ideas, as I spend a full year with this board, every meeting I go to, my mind sits here just like this. There's things on this, even the AAP, the gibbers, the training for the gibbers, to make sure the modeling of that as well. What does a teacher see in the classroom when they're looking? So I think there's continuing, as we bring this equity focus, that we're going to relook at existing practices, whether it's an appeals process, whether it's training of our teachers, whether it's more culturally responsive instruction. Remember, our cultural proficiency was 2 ladies and a PowerPoint for a system of 190,000 kids and 24,000 employees. That's not going to cut it.
Thank God.
And when you arrive, now we're getting to 10 and 12 equity positions, which is still just the beginning. Sure. We're just getting started, but we're not going to take a long time to ramp up and get where we need to get.
And I hope our staff members understand this is just a part of my passion. It's
right.
not. Right. Hopefully you don't feel like you're getting beat on or anything, but this is this is just as where my heart is, because I see it every day, and I see the difference that it makes, whether it's an economically disadvantaged family with one particular culture as opposed to those who feel as though they're just turning their kid over to a school system and they can't even question what's happening.
Yep.
And we have to deal with all of those attitudes.
And if I can connect something you said to something Elizabeth said, 5 years of wanting data, this is what I want to say to this board. This is a nugget for the afternoon. I'm going to continue to work with this team to drive transparency in data. But the data needs to become part of a collective conversation on how we get better, and not a gotcha. Right. Not a gotcha for you, not a gotcha for me, but where do we take the next steps for continuous improvement? And the more that we turn, even for our community, who will go, "Ooh, you showed this piece of data," and then we'll go out and spend hours and days defending it, or we didn't do. We need to get everybody to invite. We have a leadership team and a board willing to look at any and all data but let's come together and figure out what we're going to do about it instead of spending hours and days. Part of the issue may have been a little bit, maybe we need to have the faith not to come defensive, but to come to have collective inquiry, have an equity lens, and how do we get better together? And the more we do that, and the more that people see that, I think the more people are going to be comfortable with the data, whether it's data that we're happy about or data that we know we need to address.
So I want to comment just on one part in an extension, and then I have two things to point out, and I'll be done. With respect to communicating, I do believe a big part of our problem is the community does not know what we are offering. And so I really would love to see us figure out a way, even if we have little pamphlets. I mean, we need to start thinking like, we have a product to sell, and this is our educational package. And so the better we can present that in a condensed form so that any member of the public can access it, I think the less we have to end up defending ourselves. So that's just a footnote to what you said. The last two things I want to mention, and they really are something I just want to mention too. I don't know whether it's been considered or not, but with respect to EL learners, and I know that oftentimes we have students coming in perhaps at the high school level or whatever. It's not that they're not able to think or to learn, but there's that language problem from the very, very beginning. And have we ever considered having like algebra classes in a particular language in areas where that is the dominant language? That's the one thing. And the other thing, I think at some point we may not be able to discuss it today, but I do have some concerns about regions where we have the economically disadvantaged concentrated in those particular regions. I think it's very difficult to serve, with the same resources per region. It's just not apples to apples. And so those are two things I offer for thought, but I wanted to throw that out there. Thank you for your patience with all of my rambling.
That's great. Thank you.
Ms. Keys-Gamarra was not rambling. It's passion, and there's a lot to cover. All right, I have Ms. Strauss, followed by Ms. Dearnett Koufax, Dahlia Palchik, Sandy Evans, and then Mr. Wilson and myself.
Okay, very quickly. First of all, thank you for the attachments to the attachment. These additional tables were very, very important, and it's the first time I've seen that data disaggregated in such a granular level. So thank you very, very much. The 113, 14, 15, 16, those pages, that is very helpful. I'm eager to see what happens with the capstone pilot projects. I know that in many cases it was schools and teachers who were ready, because this is a very new thing. And for us to be able to develop a credible evaluation tool, this is cutting edge. However, 20 years ago, we would have loved to have done it, and we couldn't. Nobody was ready for it. So that is great. And again, when I think of 10, 15 years ago, we had children who had 210 days of instruction. None of you were here at that point. We had to let them go. Every time we raise class size, it has a negative impact on CTE and the courses that we can offer. Has an impact on how we can provide transportation. So as we tightened our budgets and tightened them, these are some of the things that we lost over time, which is really too bad. Just one interesting piece, there actually is a screening tool that the nurses use in the hospital when babies are born in Fairfax. It is a triage tool. And it's used primarily with moms who have come through the health department or have other needs as is perceived. And there is a triage process that helps these moms and their families either get the continued medical care that infant, because it's infant and toddler programs, or it may be home visiting programs, or it may be other programs that are offered through the county, through the health department, through Healthy Families, through HIPPY, through all of that. So we have some of those screening tools. I think one of my colleagues said, I wish they would interview them, and they actually do have the tool. I have no idea how many we miss, probably quite a few. And then we also have culturally, some families are not ready to have that kind of outreach from strangers. And that tends to be sort of an interesting challenge as they train people. I think Maura probably knows more about that through the Office for Children. And sometimes bridging that cultural gap to help people accept sometimes the help and the resources that can be provided. But that's it. My colleagues have raised a lot of very interesting stuff, and clearly there's a lot more work to do. But again, thank you very much for the tremendous amount of data and useful data that I think will help us to think more about where we need to go with all of this. So thanks.
Thank
Ms.
you.
Strauss, is there any areas in particular that you strike you that you'd like to kind of dig into for the next board discussion?
No,
or
that's
you're just
fine.
going to go with what
I'm
everybody
just
else wants?
Listening what everybody else wants, but I
Okay.
do know that some of these issues, it's a financial. If we can gain some of the ground back that we've lost over the years, some of these things would fall in place a little bit better. So thanks.
All right. Ms. Derenak, Kofax?
Thank you, and thank you for this report, everyone. It's not just numbers, but it's drilling down to the data points that show us the details behind our gaps and challenges, and I think that's very, very important. So thank you all for this hard work. Megan, I'll stay up front. My concerns are with the ELL learners and the pre-K gap, or curriculum challenges, I guess, or pre-K offerings challenges, I guess I should say, and my comments will be related to that and a little bit about AP and IB. So I am so grateful, Rich and team, for the changes made in the curriculum to allow our English language learners to earn more high school credits. I think we've seen success in that, and I am really grateful for that. We know we still have challenges with our SIFE ESOL 1 and Level 2 students. We know that student population didn't grow this much this year as it has in the past, but that population is still with us, and we're still working to get them on track. I think my colleagues, you all know that I have a budget amendment in to address this with our current year's budget. Dr. Duran and I talked about different ways to approach that. I'm not sure when we'll talk about that as a board, I guess during a budget conversation, but I think we've come to an agreement that schools with children who have who are new to the country, new to our language, limited literacy in their home language, limited numeracy skills, and there's not even a bilingual English counselor a bilingual counselor at the school. That is a minimum which we are striving for, and so that is part of the budget amendment. I hope you're all hearing that and listening that when we come to this. On the chart on page 113 that you pointed out, Sloan, thank you so much. I think for us, I would love to see a chart like that in grades 9 through 12 to see what that looks like. And I also think, as Dr. Brabrand talked about, well, I'll say it. He said it somewhat, but I was going to say, I think this is going to be one of those things where we have to have a very courageous conversation on what this means, because people say, oh, poverty, but it's not just poverty. And that chart points it out very, very adequately about how there's other impacts on this. Poverty is not the only indicator when there's gaps that happen. And I think many of my colleagues talked about the need for us to, as a system, where we can go and where we need to go to move forward in this. I think some of us, and I don't know if Dr. Brabrand shared this with you, but NSBA, we talked about a program at Montgomery County where they are seeing improvements, but it's after 12 years of a program. I don't know, have you shared that, Dr. Brabrand, with your team yet? Not yet.
Not yet. They know that we're having. They know that we're having at leadership team, the entire leadership team of Montgomery County will be coming over. We're hosting the first one sometime this summer, right. And we'll be sharing some of our similar challenges.
Well, the
and successes.
Right, and I think that's important, because in this one, and one of my colleagues had stated this, and I'm not even sure which one of you said it, but Montgomery County's program for helping to narrow the gap, they realized that there's opportunity gaps that exist that leads to the achievement gap, and in Montgomery County, because of maybe some of the things they're highlighted on chart 113, they're empowering the high school kids to take different initiatives. And it's very interesting that it's taken a long time, but they are showing significant closures in their gaps right across the river. And what it does, it's just like, the tipping point studies that we don't like to talk about, just like it, at a certain level can bring a whole school down. This is bringing the whole community up, every race, every demographic, it's bringing that up. So it'll be interesting to talk about that when you have that presentation, and I'd love to hear about that. Because one of the things that happens too is, and this is what I talked about, we need to, not just with the bilingual counselors, but as we go forward, Dr. DeGran in his, Office of Equity, Sloan, Dr. Presidio, we need to make sure that where there are high concentrations of kids who are learning, the principals shouldn't be faced, do I offer another IB class or do I offer another ELL class? Because what happens in some of these schools, then they become self-segregating, and we need equity for all. And I think that's very, very important, and that's another courageous conversation. Getting through then to, let me make sure I said everything about that I wanted to. I think so I'll move on to pre-K. I think that there have been so many avenues and so many people have been trying so hard to do this. The heat map that exists, I think it's done very well. It's a map that I have seen before, and I'm not sure if I've seen it through the county or through other presentations. It hasn't been done in such details and I applaud you for that, as to where which kind of programming is where. And through Skipped, there was a presentation in the fall, and I'd like to ask Ms. Burke, where are we on that strategic plan that was presented to Skipped in the fall?
So Tammy, you might recall that we did a next steps about our where we were going for next year and the focus areas that we had, and some of those were expanding the number of slots, and the public schools is doing that by adding an additional student, and the county is looking at adding children to the Annandale community at ACA. Through some renovation that they're doing there, and in the future they're looking at how they can add additional programs to the original Mount Vernon. We're also in the process of looking at back to the teacher learning part, developing competencies. So we're working on that piece as well. We're also, one of the other large areas of focus is mental health, and the county has identified additional funds for them to look at a mental health model that currently exists within our pre-K programs here, that allows for students to their parents to have opportunities to go through some assessments, as well as referral out if that is needed in order to address some challenges that the family and or the child is currently having. So those are some initial ones, but I can also get you the document that hashes out in more detail the financial ask versus what we are working on that it doesn't have a financial cost.
And on that plan, we did present that to the Board of Supervisors. We had wanted to present it to the school board, but we weren't able to get on a work session. But we'd love to get on a work session to show that with you. We did provide it in a Brave Brand briefing, which I know isn't the same to read that document, but we would love to be able to come before the board in a work session, similar to how we did, when was that, in January, before the Board of Supervisors, or December? I can't remember. December. So in December, we went before them and shared this strategic plan. And back to what Ms. Corbett Sanders was asking about, a strategic plan. We have one, so we would love to be able to engage in that with you all.
Right, and it was also presented to Skip. So, but it never came to this board. And I think
just
so when Ms. McLaughlin's asking about what we need to do, I think that would be a priority. And I think all of us know that, because we are making inroads. I have to give such credit to the staff, both county and Maura and her team, for what they're doing. But we don't always know, and it is slow progress. We know that's part of the reason that Skipped had begun, but Skipped is evolved. I'm not saying in a good or bad way, but it has evolved. And so it's taken a little bit of focus off of what the main priority was intended, I think. And so because the opportunity gaps that exist can be so mitigated by quality pre-K. How many times can we say that over and over and over? And yet there has never been adequate funding. Remember, Ms. Hines and I ran on that when we ran for the school board, but it has never been, and it was a county program. It's a county program, and we have really stepped into it and stepped up on it, and I appreciate that. But I think we have to, again, another courageous conversation to say, and Ms. Burke was more. I knew this before, but I couldn't state it adequately. There's so much braiding funding in this, and it's complicated. And also, there has to be a certain amount of children on the waiting list for the federal fund. So all of that has to be out there. But I think that would be, Dr. Duran, a very good reason to have a work session on that to get, because that will. Those children who are faced with those opportunity gaps there can walk into our system much better prepared. There's been data on that was talked about earlier today. So that's nothing
and
new.
Can we put that on the next steps to have that same, and it's particularly the braiding and the explanation of what is, how it's funded, et cetera. So,
well, what's funded, who funds it, what the schools have, what the county has, and what the strategic plan currently is, because it's extremely important. I share my colleagues' concerns who mentioned the capstone projects. I know it's a pilot, but I think we need to get that in other schools. And then, boy, I almost hate to bring this one up, but when we're talking about AP and IB, and I don't even know if now's the time, but it is in some ways. But there are certain schools that offer both AP and IB, and there's some schools that just offer IB. I've always been such a strong advocate for the IB curriculum, and it's not one that I think we should dismantle. But there is that equity issue about being able to walk into UVA as a sophomore if you're at an AP school, and not so much if you are at an IB school. Some schools you have to get a 7. It's what? Yeah. 6s or 7s are all that's accepted. If you get a 5, it's not good enough. You don't. So when you talk about equity, that's a hard. You're really prepared for college, but if you can't afford to go to the college because, or another person has one less year of college, literally, because of what they were given in Fairfax County Public Schools, I think that's something we need to look at least offering it dual, because I know there's a couple high schools that do and a couple that don't. So that's my thing, talking about deeper dives into the ELL program, what we can do to support it, what we can do to support those schools that are seeing a higher concentration coming into the schools, and making sure that there's equity for all in those schools, and all of the pre-K stuff we just talked about.
Thank you, Ms. Derenak-Kofax. And I did make a note, since you opened your remarks with the areas that you'd like to focus on. Ms. Palchuk, followed by Ms. Evans, and then I have Mr. Wilson and myself on deck.
Thank you. I will try to be brief, but this is, I think, one of our most important presentations, so thank you for all of the work. I will also echo in Ms. Derenak-Kofax many of the remarks, but also will explain a little bit of, I will ask a few questions first, especially around our immersion programs, graduation rates, and students with disabilities. And then I do want to give a little bit more of my take and information and next steps I would also like to see for the pre-K program. So I guess my first question is, very simply, when we talk about former ELs, are these students who are above level 6? Are they level 6? Where do we make the cutoff?
Okay, good question. So the state now identifies the entire English learner subgroup as current English learners, so levels 1 through 5 and level 9, that's our kindergarten students, and 6A through 6D. So those are English learners. They're actually current English learners and some former English learners. The other former English learners that we're talking about are what we call level 10 DM. That means 10 dismissed. That's beyond level 6D. And so it can get complicated. So the former English learners are actually 6A all the way through, level 10.
So it includes the 6A.
Yeah,
when we're
6A,
okay.
That's right.
Okay.
So the graduation data that Dr. Presidio mentioned earlier is the non-English learners. It's a combination of some former English learners and some Hispanic students that were never identified as needing ESOL services.
Okay.
English learners.
Okay, perfect. No, that's helpful just to know who we're talking about.
I'll explain it 4 or 5 more times to everybody. I'll kind of have individual board meetings just to talk about the
Okay, and so
between.
the students, just to clarify, the students who are identified there as ELs are up to level 5 and 9 for kindergarten.
I was going to make a joke about that, but we need to explain that too because the WIDA leveling has also changed.
Right. So the English learners that we are talking about go up through level 5. We have very few level 5s this year, and including level 9, which is kindergarten.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. But a lot of that is 3rd and up, so they're not included. Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Another question, I know we're talking about world language, and I would like us to continue that conversation. I know Noel and I were just speaking on that a bit. Do you know currently how many of our schools, I know we had this data before, are eligible for local dual immersion programs? I know Dr. Duran had gathered that information, and how many are pursuing it or are planning on pursuing it?
So we have about 25 that would be eligible in terms of having the threshold percentage of enough students that would be native speakers of the target language. So think, for example, native Spanish-speaking students would be eligible to receive services in a particular school. So you could have a dual immersion program there in Spanish and in English. In terms of the number that are pursuing, this has been a difficult lift for us for a variety of reasons. The main reason is finding qualified licensed teachers that we can put into those programs. And if we could figure that out, then I don't think we would have much of a problem. But that has been a real challenge. And our principals are working really hard to try to figure that out. So we continue to work with HR and explore opportunities. We continue to advocate at the state around flexible licensure. So we're working on it, but we're really not making the kind of progress that we had hoped to have made by now.
So that's the main obstacle right now is the staffing, or is it a little bit just the fear of not being able to get that staffing in the future?
Well, I mean, there's definitely a concern about, if I hire this individual now and I start this program and then that person leaves and moves, am I going to be able to replace that person and the additional person that I'm going to need to hire to bring on the next grade level in the subsequent years? So, I mean, it's all kind of wrapped around, the staffing issues.
Yeah, so as we move forward, it would be interesting to hear the initiatives that you are working on and just to kind of see what we've looked at, what other districts are doing. I know we've gone to Puerto Rico quite a bit, and what more we could do to support that. My other question is with early childhood, I know you didn't go into the factors of what may be coming into effect and some of the decreased increase in test scores that we see from pre-K to elementary school. I don't know. So we saw, a big boost at the beginning of elementary school, and in some areas that's decreased. So I know you didn't go into those factors, and I don't know if that's a larger conversation, but whether it's, I know we focus quite a bit on school culture and programs at the high school. Are we seeing that at the elementary school, or do you feel that we need to do a little bit more for lowering the affective filter, having, doing walkthroughs through our schools to ensure students and families are comfortable or engaged? And ACA is a wonderful program, and I know that they've asked some questions about what happens to their students once they go into our elementary school. So I don't know if we have some data of some of the maybe non-FCPS programs, and also recommendations on what more we can do at the K-3, especially K-5 level for our students.
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point. I mean, first I would say, as I kind of mentioned earlier, we have to be a little bit careful with the longitudinal impact because so many things happen in those subsequent years after that transition from pre-K to kindergarten. But you're definitely on the right track in terms of we need to be figuring out, what is effective, where could we make program improvements, and that's really the focus of the UVA study. So we have this longitudinal research project with the University of Virginia. Last year, the dean came down and presented a little bit of information to the school board on what the project was just kind of conceptually really about. At that point, we were just in the process of enrolling, preschool students and trying to get their information, make sure that we were getting, their teachers connected to the survey. But that's a longitudinal program, and we'll continue to get updates on the findings from UVA. But before we can kind of get to the point of, third grade, for example, let's say, it's going to be a few years before we start to get that longitudinal impact. But UVA has been really responsive in terms of giving us their updates as they go along. So we'll be working with them again this summer to look at findings from year 2 of the study. So that's one of the big pieces. The other piece that you mentioned is I do think there are some things for us, and actually several board members mentioned it, that we need to start to figure out where are some high leverage points for us, because one of the things that I've kind of always said about Fairfax, and it occurred to me when I first got here, I hadn't been here very long, is we can really do probably anything, but we can't do everything at the same time, right? So we've got to start to more strategically focus where our efforts are. Early childhood years might be one of the areas that we need to really kind of double down and focus our efforts in terms of making sure that those students are getting off to a really strong start, kindergarten through third grade. So again, there's some opportunities, I think, for us to maybe prioritize some of our resources and supports in more different ways as we go through this streamlined strategic planning process with the board.
Okay. I appreciate that. And perhaps in the meantime, while we're waiting for the longitudinal data, I don't know if it's possible if you've collected or are planning on collecting data from maybe other districts that have seen, effective programming, whether it's curriculum, instruction, leadership at the school level and other that's really supported their kids past, K to 3 and beyond. That would be helpful. Moving on, I have one question, and I know Ms. Keys-Gamarra had concerns and questions around our advanced academic placement. I also had some questions. I did a little bit of notepad math here, looking at our populations represented of students with disabilities. And so I don't know if it's correct. I was trying to do a little quick math. From what I saw, students representing the full population, just the reading scores, it had for white students is about the same 39% of students with disabilities and students in the full population for reading. So how many, the percentage of full population students that were white and the percentage that were full population students with disabilities that were white was pretty similar. When I started to look at Hispanic students, it was a pretty big gap. 24% of the overall population of those students was Hispanic, while 32% approximately were students with disabilities. And again, for Black students, I also saw a smaller, but a gap again. So I do have concerns about AAP. I also have questions and concerns about our identification process. And if you've looked at that, or if we could study it further, of our students being identified with disabilities who may be ELs, who may be Hispanic, who may be students living in poverty. So I don't know if you have ideas or questions or something that we could discuss further.
I think those topics probably warrant more than, a 30-second answer. So I don't know, maybe if there's some way that you might want to craft that into a next step, or maybe that's a conversation actually that would be better for us to have to really kind of dig into the data points that you want to explore. Maybe that would be the immediate next step. I'm not sure.
I think Dr. Presidio has something.
Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry, Polio.
Mr. Polio. Yeah.
So just speaking from the L perspective. Okay. So we have worked the last few years with DSS to really improve our to ensure that we're not over-identifying English learners, for example, for special education services. One of the ways that we've collaborated is on dual language consultations, as opposed to students who just so if a student is an English learner, a school starts to have concerns about their academic performance. In the past, we might have jumped straight to a dual language assessment to see about special education eligibility. Now we've we've really increased the number of consultations ahead of time, working within our RI process, working with all with DSS, and really working together to ensure that we're looking at we're looking at all the different factors that go into English learning before making a jump to possible special education services.
That's really helpful. So perhaps to get more information on that and any changes we've seen because of it, or further recommendations, maybe we could meet, but I would love to get more information on that work. Thank you. And then finally, back to our big pre-K. I also attended a second conference while we were at NSBA, a Latinx conference, and had the opportunity to meet several people and the superintendent from Fort Worth, Texas. And they actually did pretty innovative community-wide work. And so they worked together with the faith community, the business community, the county or their city, and they were able to get funding for pre-K for all 4-year-olds through foundation grants and community effort. They have 86,000 students, so about half of our size, but also seeing increased population of students. And they've been focused on pre-K, on K-3 literacy, and on middle school math. Those are the superintendent, he was a Spanish teacher in Philadelphia. I don't know if you ever came across him. Before he went to Arizona and now Fort Worth. And their new initiative, and I want to read a little bit because I was very moved by the joint letter from the mayor and the superintendent, is as the mayor of Fort Worth and as superintendent of the Fort Worth ISD, we believe wholeheartedly that the key to our long-term success as a community is found in the education of our children, our future workforce. Fort Worth is now home to more than 830,000 residents. It's one of the fastest growing cities in the U.S. and boasts an average age 7 years younger than the national average. For too long, the Fort Worth business community and civic leaders have been disconnected from our public schools. Now the greater community has an opportunity to step up and get involved to support the tireless work being done by our educators. This was a letter to the educators. That is why we are launching the Fort Worth Literacy Partnership with one goal: 100% third grade graders reading on grade level by 2025. So this is really, and he was happy to connect with us and happy to connect you with the superintendent, really have done a lot of work in the community to bring together all of the stakeholders outside of the school, the partners. I know I've had several meetings with Edu Futuro, and we've all been meeting with our stakeholders in the community. And I am not on the SCIPT committee, but I guess I would like to, when we have this discussion, to start to think about how we want to tackle some of our goals beyond just the doors of FCPS. What it means on the partnership level, what it means on the funding level, what those main goals should be. You know, we can't have everyone doing everything in our strategic plan, but where are the areas where we can see that can be most effective? And also, I appreciate that we're working with Montgomery County. There were members from PG County. I know they have about 10 community schools, so perhaps we can do a little bit more to be, I know we want the funding and I know we want the programming, but maybe to start to bring together our stakeholders and have a plan in order to get to the funding plan. So I hope we can include that. Sorry, I had one last question I forgot. We focused on the APIB testing. Do we have the rates for students taking SATs in our schools out of the total number of, I guess, do we look at just juniors or?
Yeah, we could get that as a next step.
Okay, that would be helpful. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Palchuk. I now have Ms. Sandy Evans.
Thank you very much. And this is an excellent report. I very much appreciate all the detail in it. And I agree with what some of my colleagues said about spending more time delving deeper into some. And I guess in the future, I guess I would advocate that we spend the day on this report. Actually, I think that it's warranted. So, but for the future, Ms. McLaughlin, you've asked about follow-ups, and so I'll just tell you up front, this pre-K certainly And work experiences is another area, and outreach to Hispanic families and students or areas. So I want to congratulate you on some of the great strides forward. Particularly the number of credits, high school credits that our English language learners are earning now. That's a huge step forward. I know some of that is because of the pilot that we have at Stewart and Lee, and I guess other efforts that we've made. But that should, I see in your report that we should see the fruit of that in terms of graduation rates in this coming year. Is that correct? Is that right?
We think, we'll see some increase. And first of all, I appreciate the recognition for the work that's been done, but that's really Rich and his team, obviously, that have been leading that work. So they've done a fantastic job starting at Lee and Stewart and then expanding that work across the system. So I think we'll see some increase next year. The following year, I think we would see a larger increase. That would be
because it was rolled out to more schools.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And where we had started with students at the 9th grade and them having the opportunity to matriculate up through graduation.
I'm also seeing this stunning figure on page 30 of the narrative that the number of ELLs in Algebra 1 in high school tripled. So I think that's a good thing. I see that the numbers in passing in 8th grade have gone down, but that doesn't mean that perhaps the students need more time to get the English language before they head into algebra. So could you talk a little bit about that, about the Algebra 1 number of ELLs? I'm looking on page 30 of the narrative.
Yeah, so we've worked over the last few years, again, beginning at Lee and Stewart, and generally lots of our English learners, beginning English learners, newly arrived English learners, come in and start in individual math, so a pre-algebra class. What we did for the pilot programming was we had a double block of math, and we really think that adding that double block is what helped prepare students so that they weren't languishing in a pre-algebra state for years and years. And so really it's been just 1 year, and then Lee and Stewart have done a great job, and the other schools now this year, of getting students into algebra, and many with a support class. So many of our algebra students are taking a double block, either algebra 1 part 1. So it's a support class for algebra. So we have been able to, for particularly the lower levels of English language learners, we've significantly increased the number of students taking algebra.
I'd say that's huge. So kudos to those that made that happen, and pass rate going up by 10 points. That's excellent. Now, on the other hand, we still have other things we need to look at. I'm looking at the Hispanic participation rate in SATs is only 43%, and that's not just ELLs. We're talking about all Hispanic students. I would say that's an area where we certainly can grow. We're only talking about students who take the test, right? So if it's only 43%, I've got to think that there are many more ways to be encouraging those students. I was very pleased to see your recognition in terms of where we're going of the impact of the parent liaisons and the importance that they can have on reaching out to families, reaching out to students. I think that's an area where we can increase perhaps time from our, particularly in areas that have high numbers of English language learners and or Hispanic students, as well as those with economically disadvantaged. I think that can be a big part of our efforts there. I think they can help a lot. So I'll turn to pre-K, and I know people have had a number of things to say about that. I did want to focus on the same heat map, and I agree that it's excellent to have this heat map, and if you're on the narrative, it's on page 61. I apologize if I didn't find it. I see that we have the numbers by region, but your numbers show that 13,855 kids are under the age of 5 living in poverty. We're serving 2,635, and then another 2,000 have a subsidy, and we have a wait list of 473. because of what we see is the large number of Hispanic students that come in without pre-K, I do wonder again about our outreach. And even though we have a wait list of 473, I've got to think that there are more people in the community who just don't apply. I mean, isn't that maybe that's stating the obvious, but do we have any sense, any number of how many students there actually are out there that should be applying for this program, that are living in poverty or have English language needs that aren't on the waiting list? Do we have any sense of that? Did Skip look into that?
We do have that number. I'm not sure if Ms. Burke has that memorized or not.
Well, if we could get that, I would appreciate that. And while I'm looking at the number with that pre-K experience by pyramid, I'm seeing the heat map, but I'm not seeing the numbers that go with it by pyramid. Could we get those? I'm seeing it by region, but of course regions, Region 2 has Stewart in it and it has McLean in it. So, those are two different things. Could we get those, just the number of total in kindergarten and the number coming in without pre-K experience by pyramid?
Yeah, we should be able to get that. We'll have to see how we display that.
Okay.
It might have to be in a chart when we break it down to that granular level, but we can do that.
Okay,
yeah.
That would be great. And I would also like to see among those on the wait list where they are. And if we could, I'd like to see that by elementary school, how many of the kids are waiting to go in and aren't able to get in by elementary. I believe we had that at one point. Last time we got the breakdown, my recollection is the highest number was at Bailey's. I don't know if Bailey's is still the highest number or not. Is that true? Yes. Bailey's is still the highest? Okay. I would very much like to see, and Bailey's now, we talk about not having room. Bailey's now has room, for pre-K. So it's not a facilities issue anymore. It was at the time, because we had 19 trailers there, and we had to send the kids over to Falls Church High School for a while to handle that. But since we have room now, I would hope that we could get more of those students who, many of those I know, are both English language learners and live in poverty. So I would love to get more of those dealt with. Thank you for that information. I will agree with those that talked about the internet access. While it was a large number of respondents, we still had 100,000 that didn't say anything. I mean, how do you read that? Are we assuming that the same percentage has internet access and the same percentage have computer? I would not make that assumption.
Yeah, I think the way that I would first read that is understanding that this is the emergency care card that families are filling out.
Right.
They may not be inclined to answer if they have more than one child. They may not be inclined to answer more than once.
Uh-huh.
The other thing is, I think that when they answered the first question about internet usage, that's pretty straightforward, and I think they understood it. Now, I don't know if that means computer internet usage or cell phone internet usage, which is completely not very helpful in terms of the kind of work that we want students to be able to do. They really need a computer, not a cell phone. But I think the second question about adequate computer use, I think, is confusing perhaps to some families.
That could.
They might not really know what is adequate. Now, we added that.
If you can go to the library, is that adequate?
If
I have 2 computers in my house, but I really think I need 3. Yeah.
Right, and we added that question in large part because of some of the feedback that we had from families before where they were saying, more and more things are needing to be done on the computer, and I don't have adequate computer access because I've only got my personal computer and I can't share that with two children to do the work.
Yeah.
But I think that maybe that question wasn't answered as frequently because I think maybe people didn't quite fully really understand what that meant.
Okay. Well, my point would be that I would not make the assumption that those that didn't reply have the same level of access and adequate computer as those that did. Yep. So I think we have to assume that there are a higher percentage there. And then I guess I know others want to go into other or are waiting, but on the work experience, I will agree with Ms. Corbett-Sanders and Ms. Keys-Gamarra about hoping that we can expand those projects a little more equitably. I'm looking at 16 schools, and I don't know how many of those. I mean, we're only having 16 schools, and I see you didn't include Belvedere as one of those, even though it's an IB primary years program, and they do have a fifth
Which
grade
page
project.
are you on, just for reference purposes?
Let's see. That is on Capstone Project. That was on page 53. And someplace in the, yes, down there it lists the
So
schools.
this is the capstone pilot. Yeah, I mean it's interesting because there is a lot of similarity between the IB learner profile, the IB personal projects,
right,
and our portrait of a graduate and our
right,
capstone projects.
So maybe we're not.
So I think they're doing a lot of the same work, those IB schools. They just don't necessarily happen to be in this particular pilot because we're trying to work with schools that hadn't been doing this work to initiate the work. And there's no question that, you know, we could have a more representative sample of pilot schools, and that's something I think as a leadership team that we definitely can debrief and talk about how we can do better on that in the future, for sure.
And I would say, you know, the projects that they do at Belvedere in fifth grade are phenomenal.
They're amazing.
So even though they're not officially in this, I would add that as, you know, project-based learning at one school. So
absolutely.
So there may be some that we're not capturing, but to the extent that we are do we have a plan for expanding the capstone project pilot? Or, I mean, I know it's all money, right? But
yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, it really is resource dependent and workload dependent in terms of what schools can take on. So, you know, we've thought about in all of our projects, we think about how we're going to measure success and then how we scale those when we are able to determine success. And we can cost things out, but they're, of course, dependent on resources and then the school having the available capacity, if you will, from a workload standpoint to take that work on.
Right. So my last comments will be about work, and I will agree with my colleagues who certainly appreciate all the added emphasis. Certainly with things like Genesis Works, that has been a marvelous program. I think it still only serves a relatively small number of people, but we can build on that, and I would like to see us do so. I think it's important, the very, very last page, you know, when we look at the number of our students, and I think there's a misunderstanding sometimes of how many of our students that graduate from here. Most of them go to college, but we've still got about 60% that graduate from college in 4 to 6 years. I mean, I'd love to see that higher, but we have a responsibility to make sure when our students leave here that they can also go into the working world, or at least have some experience in the working world. And while we can hope that our future students, that number continues to go up, we do have an obligation to have our students be work ready. With the, I'll point out something that I pretty much point out yearly on the industry credentials, that the vast majority of it's financial literacy, which they have to take, and a lot of it's Microsoft Office, which is fine. But I don't think, when we talk about industry credentials, I think many of us think in terms of pharmacy or EMT or engineering or something other than the required financial literacy. So while that's going up, it may not indicate that quite so many are getting the kind of industry credentials that would be good for them to have when they leave school. And then I was surprised to see, am I reading this right, that the number of teaching positions at our academies hasn't increased in 20 years? I'm looking at page 95, if you want to reference where I'm looking.
Yeah, we have not seen really a market growth in the amount of dedicated staffing that we've put into our academy programs in a number of years. You're correct. And that was one of the things I was addressing in response to Mr. Moon's question earlier, is that, when we want these students in these work-based learning experiences, you need some fundamental and foundational coursework, obviously,
Right.
first, something to tie that to.
Right.
And a lot of that work is really a lot of those programs are really in our academies.
Right.
So, if we want to continue to drive that work, we need to think either about investing differently in our academies or think about a different structure for some of those programs being more available in base schools.
And I think that's probably something we should be looking at in the future, because particularly since we have a wait list for these programs, maybe we need to be expanding the academies to more schools or increasing the amount of teaching staff. So thank you. And I think, Ms. McLaughlin, I gave you my areas of focus, and thank you for an excellent report.
Great. Mr. Wilson?
Thank you, and I'll be brief. So I think an area of focus I'd like to, if it's not already on the list, is to come back and evaluate the implementation of the one-on-one computing, the FCPS on. We have now had a couple years within one high school pyramid, and I'd love to go a little bit deeper to find out what have been the academic effects of that, what have the families experienced, what have the students experienced, and also what is the evaluation of the filtering tools that we have in place. I know Dr. Brabrand in a Brabrand briefing talked about contracting for a improved, more robust filtering contract. I think we all just need to understand that better, in particular because when we're talking about balancing priorities and funding, I think understanding the value of implementing further one-on-one computing is important when we're balancing it against our limited resources.
So just real briefly, because we will be happy to do that, the evaluation that Johns Hopkins is doing does include teacher, parent, student surveys and interviews. So we have a lot of qualitative information from our stakeholders in addition to the quantitative information as well.
Perfect. Yeah, and I think it's all very helpful. Obviously, I think achievement, being this is student success, we want to focus on that and see whether or not we're getting bang for our buck in terms of all the different measurements, because that implementation is, I believe, K through 12 in the Chantilly pyramid. So we should be now starting to see whether or not we're seeing any benefits at different levels. So I also would just underscore that the pre-K discussion, I think many of us, maybe all of us, have touched on it. I also want to talk about that a little bit more. And in particular, I would be interested, I think, in what Ms. Palchik was mentioning about more longitudinal information about, going beyond K3 to 8th and really following through. What is the information? What does the data tell us? And with regards to the special education, I would like to know, resources that are devoted to infant toddler identification of the disabilities and providing the resources to those families, being married to an early intervention specialist. She constantly reiterates the importance of identifying, that kid who has hearing impairments so that they can get their cochlear implant, right? So that they can start to learn and be able to speak and those sorts of things. So I would love to hear, because again, it's sort of a comparison of where are we going to get the most value for the money that we spend. The last question is really probably not addressed in what you provided to us, and I confess I haven't read every word, but is there any metric in what you provided us that makes a distinction between the degree that a teacher holds, whether that is a bachelor's or a master's degree or a PhD?
No, we've only provided the board-approved metrics in the report, so those are the only ones that we're reporting on, and that wasn't one in Goal 1.
Okay. And is there research that would demonstrate, we're going to have a discussion about BA lanes here in a few minutes, so is there research that would show a discrepancy between the benefits to students?
Well, I just came back from the research conference, and I'm sure that there must be research on that. I'm not familiar enough to speak extemporaneously on what those findings might be right now, but that could be a next step if you'd like us to look at that.
Well, I don't know that it's a next step. I think that it would be useful information if we're going to make distinctions between our teachers. So
okay.
That's all. Thanks.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm last on the list, and I'll be honest, I'm thinking probably the easiest thing to do is stay as high level as I can. And Dr. Duran, Dr. Presidio, and team up here, I do want to, of course, echo my appreciation for the volume of data that's been brought to the table. And please forgive me when I look this direction now, but I've been guided by your superintendent that I need to look at him when I need to say where I may not feel like I'm getting what I need. So I know you're famous for the Cat 1, Cat 2, Cat 3 analogy. And I'm listening to my colleagues, and I think maybe I just have an entirely different expectation. But when I look at the report on page 5, when it was the report introduction, and it says that each chapter will include strategy introduction, related desired outcomes, monitoring metric data, and analysis. I would say we've got those first, 3 areas there, all the way up to the metric data. We do have that. I know we're going to have additional conversations about which data is meaningful, and I am 100% with Dr. Presidio, who ran an excellent pre-meeting with us, that there's a lot in here, and I don't even know that it's all essential data that's, going to get us where we need. But even when the data's there, that last word analysis, I think I just have a different understanding of what that analysis will look like. And I want to kind of give you just a quick example. When we were looking at the AP and IB metric, and when it says implications, well, first of all, descriptive analysis was just simply describing the chart. But I don't think that's analysis. And I looked up a report actually written by the National, I think, Center on, and I'm going to forward it to you and the board, but what descriptive analysis is and what this is, they're very different. And I want the analysis because part of what we need to understand is, so you guys have gathered incredible volumes of data, but since it's your report to the board and obviously then to the public wants to understand, what do you think about the data you see? When you read this report, there's really not a lot of analysis that's provided here. And again, I will go to, as Dr. Presidio said, when this thing is massive, there's actually not even hours in the day for you guys to probably do the type of analysis we need. So one side plug is we need to reinvigorate our Office of Research and whatever we're now calling it, because when Pat Murphy, former assistant superintendent here, but now Superintendent Arlington, when he ran the Department of Accountability, there was more staff and more ability to do real robust analysis and reporting. And I just don't think we have the staffing for it with the size of our system. But as a result, I don't think this report does that. And as a board member, I don't feel like I come away from this annual report saying, I understand what we're doing, boots on the ground, and I feel confident that the things we're doing to close gaps is going to get us there. Like, I just feel like this was a really awesome data flash of here's what we got.
Well, if I could just say real briefly, because I think it's important, in the spirit of transparency and, not being perfect, but always improving, to kind of understand the tone and really what we were trying to go for here. And if it doesn't hit the mark, that's completely fine, and we're happy to kind of reconceptualize what that report would look like in the future. What we tried to do here with the 3 levels of analysis was basically give, because again, this is a report for the board, but it's also a report for the community. It's already 150 pages long because it's got so many metrics that we're trying to report on. We wanted to try to make it accessible. So we tried to use a structure that we use in education sometimes when you look at data, which is basically to say, here's what the data say. So what? What does it really mean? What's it telling us that we think is important? And now what? And that was really, but I wasn't going to put in this report, here's what, so what, now what. That didn't quite seem right? So some of my subject headings definitely could probably have, the nomenclature could have been better. But to your point, the level of analysis still is a high level of analysis. It isn't probably as in-depth as certain board members would like to see in certain areas, and we're happy to follow up, and give you additional information. We're certainly happy to adjust the format for next year, but because you bring it up, I did want to say that I agree with you. It's a pretty high level of analysis, but that was kind of the structure of what we were trying to go for.
Right, and I appreciate that. And I think where my concern is that trying to understand the now what, I'll give an example. So I've heard today community schools, and that is something that Skip is looking at, and I'm part of that subcommittee, and I'm really excited about what it can do. What would a community school be the now what? If we're looking at these gaps of our poverty gap, we're looking at our English as a second language gap, and we're looking at our gaps among racial and ethnic groups. And then, when we were talking with Dr. Presidio, he broke out for Tom and me, but it's not in this report, and it's going to be my absolute next step is, in Fairfax County student population, approximately 8% of white students are in poverty. About 21% of Asian students are in poverty. Approximately 48% of black students are in poverty, and approximately 66% of Hispanics are in poverty. Well, then when you go to the next chart and you look at any one of these on the reading and math gap, and you look at what happens with our poverty students, the pass rates are at 66% to 68%. So when you end up seeing that the overlapping, and I know Dr. Presidio, you talked about that a little bit, but we still had it presented in a way that was sort of still in those single stovepipes. And when you start to do an overlay and you start to end up seeing that a large percentage of our Hispanic students are in poverty, and a large percentage of our students who are Hispanic are also English as a second language. So then part of what are going to be our efforts, our programs to target that. Well, community schools where you have after-school support programs, so students can get the support that they may not be able to get at home, where parents have a college education, parents have the money to pay for tutors. Look at our SAT participation rates. Well, if you don't have parents who went to college and are talking about it, how about our SAT score differentials? I mean, my husband and I did not take SAT prep classes. I venture to guess you survey any middle-income family in Fairfax County, and a vast portion of those kids are taking SAT prep classes. So what are we doing for our kids whose families can't afford that $1,000 class or more? I mean, those are creating gaps. And I'm when it's not in here, then what I don't know is if the division's even aware of it. I can be aware of it because I'm still a high school parent. I'm still seeing it and living it. And Dr. Brabrand, you're going to be living it, and that's a good thing. But, those are things where when I look at this report, I want to sort of understand, so what, I think you all did a good job. So what, we're seeing that we've got gaps that are persisting. But the now what, some of them were so high level under the AP and IB participation. One of the areas of focus said continued expansion of family engagement across ethnicities and subgroups to promote enrollment in these courses. I mean, that's a piece of it, but there's still a whole nother part of it that go back to middle school. How many kids are taking honors courses and getting that encouragement? Ms. Palchek, I'm with you, and Ms. Koufax and Ms. Karen Keys-Gamara, we talked about how are we pipelining these kids in? I mean, when you look at the demographics in our AAP program alone, I mean, that's teeing up a certain percentage of kids to their peer group is going to start talking about college as early as the 3rd to 6th grade. I lived it. So those are kind of the macro level things that I wanted to sort of touch on that I would like to see that, and a piece of it is to Dr. Presidio again, I'm not a fan of some of our strategies, and I'm not a fan of some of the desired outcomes, and I'm not a fan of some of the metrics. And my deeper dive is when we talk about grading and reporting, I'll meet offline to talk about it, but when you run your calculations across the chart of if you got a score of a 5 on an AP, what percentage got an A minus all the way down? And then when you go the other direction on the chart, and it's if you got an A, what percentage got 5s all the way down to a 1? That vertical going down added up to about 100%. But you go across the other way, and it could be anywhere from 125 to 175%. So I don't know how that was being done. Maybe it was because you do it one way, flip it and do it the other way. But Dr. Brabrand, you may not be aware of this, but Francis Ivey in Region 5 has done some really remarkable work. We're really dedicated to looking at how does grading accurately reflect student mastery and knowledge. She's doing the analysis that I'm talking to other regions, they're not doing yet. And it hasn't been standardized, and it is not in this report, but it is very simple. We're looking at, so when you look across the courses, not just within the school, across teachers, but even across similar high schools of demographics, in an AP class, what percentage of these kids were getting A's, what percentage were getting B's and C's, and there is sometimes very big differentials. And so we can end up communicating, oh, we've got gaps in terms of, GPAs and things, but it can just be the grading culture that's in there. So there's more things that I'd like to see that I thought would be meaningful. So appreciate your inviting us to come talk with you one-on-one, because we are a board of 12. You got to get your work done, and coming and talking with us is, going to add to your day. But
no, we're happy to do it. Our job is to help you with the information that you need to have to make decisions. So, it's hard to get all this into one report. So we're happy to have those conversations.
So my final glows, Dr. Brabrand, number one, loved your enthusiasm to say that you embrace our desire as a board to engage with you and your team on this. And my other glows, Dr. Presidio truly was a joy to run through this. Really incredible in his collaborative nature, and I know that speaks for a lot of your team, but I wanted to give you a shout out because you were awesome in our pre-meeting, and I appreciate it.
I would just wrap up to say, is the data better presented than it was a year, 2 years, 5 years ago? Is it or isn't it? It is. So I'm smiling. I'm letting you smile to know many of you met with me in July. You should already be seeing changes. You'll see more. It all can't. If we did it all in 1 year, what else would there be to do? Right? We'd be fully funded budget, more CIP.
Yeah.
It's going to get better. The analysis is going to get better. One of the reasons I would tell you, though, at state high level, leadership teams going through every strategic action and really reviewing and I'm just being honest, owning as a leadership team, do we think this is the action to put before the board and the community to move us to the performance target for the metric that we picked?
Excellent.
So that's part of that work we're doing right now. And I will tell you, yes, fidelity of implementation's been the issue because 32 things have not been implemented with fidelity well in the system. We've got to shrink it, get you to agree as a board which ones we're going to work on hard for the next 2 years. It doesn't mean that other stuff necessarily stops, but where are we working system-wide, where every RAS is doing it, every department is doing it, every principal is doing it, and I think we're going to continue to get better, but I'm really proud. I've had glow and grow conversations with every member of the leadership team, and I told Sloan, maybe I shouldn't be sharing a private conversation. You don't want me to share that? Okay. Well, it would be kind of nice. I think
I'm an open book, too.
I think Sloan is brilliant at sharing in these settings the information and his team, and I think the data was very well presented. I think we can deepen the analysis, which we will. And I think some of the Office of School Support expansion that we're going to do is going to make sure that we deliver on the strategic actions in every region and every school more next year than we have before. One of the things, too, a shout out for Francisco about community schools that a couple of you mentioned. He's already gone over to Montgomery County and looked at community schools, even before our leadership team meeting. I don't remember if you took county people with you or just it was our school people.
It was part of SCIP. It was a committee of us
it
from
was
SCIP.
with SCIP.
And there were county folks and United Way and others.
And guess what? Montgomery County is ahead of Fairfax County on this work. And we got to be willing to say in Fairfax that somebody else, just like I talked about the cats in August, somebody else is doing it better. Now, the same NSBA thing we just went to, Montgomery County came over and said social emotional learning. Fairfax, you're leagues ahead, years ahead of us, even though I think we still have real work to do. But that was just an interesting comparison. I know we got a lot of other stuff to talk about, but thank you, and I appreciate it. And folks worked really hard. I want to give them a big round. Can we give them a big round of applause for a nice job? Oh, yeah.
Okay, so very quickly, we're going to go to next steps, and hopefully wrap up so we can move on to our third session, where I deeply appreciate every member in the audience for your patience. We did not anticipate our other session to go as long. So next steps, Mr. Moon, describe compounded impact of ELL and FRM status on student achievement. All in favor? Great. Okay, in an effort to reduce achievement gaps, look at ways to empower and equip parents to be able to help their students better. All in favor? That's just direction to the superintendent. On academy programs, find out.
Can I apologize? Sorry. For that one, I meant to mention it. Can we include things we are currently doing and then ways to improve that? I know and where, and then how to improve it. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, well, you can just say list current programs and identify additional ways. Yeah. Okay. On academy programs, find out whether there is a need for freshmen and sophomores to access them, how many students are turned away, and how many staff would it take to meet the needs. Is that okay? All right.
Space.
Okay. Support. Great. Okay. Oh, wow. Okay. We've got to go back down a little bit. Okay. How many of the 25% earning biliteracy seal are former ELL students? Is that clear? Yeah, she was saying the disaggregated data. Okay. Support for that? Okay. Consider potentially cross-pollinating professional development between, school board and LT, right? Yeah, it's between school board. Yeah. School board and LT. Okay. Does everybody understand what that means? It means sort of a more of our conversation. Shared opportunity, but it's professional development centered around data, right? No? Oh, okay. Just professional development in general. Okay. So it's the operative word is consider potentially. So nothing's being put in stone, but it's for Dr. Brabrand to consider and review with staff. Is there support for that, to have the Dr. Brabrand consider it with his team?
Sure.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, then we got enough. Provide next steps planned for the capstone pilot and how it will be expanded with a more equitable lens. Everybody in support of that? Okay. Discussion between the regional area superintendents, magisterial, and or at-large members about how slide 34 looks on a school-by-school basis, and that was about the AP to letter grade data. Okay. AP to letter grade data. Everybody's supportive of that. Again, we're not promising you to have to do anything, but it's an ask. Provide plan to address issues on the preschool gap, including community stakeholders. What do you mean by including community stakeholders?
I think what I asked for was a comprehensive plan to address the number of vacancies or the demand for preschool that we're not satisfying, and it should include utilizing resources that go beyond just Fairfax County Public Schools to be Fairfax County Public Schools, Board of Supervisors, faith-based community, a comprehensive plan.
But is that, can I interrupt? Because I had one I don't see about mine about looking at the strategic plan that's already out there. That was before I said, you commented before I talked.
Correct. And so I was asking for it, and then you said, oh, well, we have that in the strategic plan.
We have
but
one.
we want to make sure it addresses the holistically and not just count. Okay.
Right.
I would. Oh, go ahead.
So we need to share it and
I'm just worried that a
session
next step is directing staff time to create a comprehensive plan when
one exists.
I mean, that's not a next step. I mean, that's I mean, there is somewhat of a plan. I mean,
There is a strategic plan.
Right, there's a
We
strategic
just
plan,
haven't seen
but
it
you
yet.
don't create a comprehensive plan in the next step. We don't
No,
direct staff that
Elizabeth,
way.
she said provide, which means I think she understood one exists already. Provide it so the board can see it.
Yeah, so
So
then
it's-
make it the subject of a discussion with the board. Bring it to the board.
So in other words, they're already working on a preschool.
We have the one that Skip approved that the Board of Supervisors received. I would suggest you would just ask us in a work session to bring that and present it to you.
And that is
That to
actually
me is the
one of
next
our-
step, is to
yes.
bring that to,
So isn't the next,
that would
step?
be my
I'm trying to get to what the next step is schedule a work session to discuss the accountability and plans around
School
expanding
it's called
preschool.
School Readiness Plan.
School readiness.
Strategic
I mean, it
plan,
already
yes.
exists, we just want to talk about it.
Correct.
Well, as we go down the list, if we can look to see if it's duplicated, then we'll just take just
Okay.
one of them off.
All right, so Karen, we'll keep that there. That's good.
We can always combine them.
Support, yep. Okay. Provide data on how many students take advantage of CTE and academy programs. We don't have that? I thought it was
It's
on page
more
2.
than that. It was
Okay.
actually, and we need to communicate, we need to have a communications plan
Well, it's not, then that's
to
not that
create
one.
better awareness of our CTE and
So-
academy
so
programs
scroll
so that
up,
we
it's
expand.
possible- hold on. If you scroll up, maybe that's the next one, because this one is, I think, when you first asked, and they might have said to you that was.
What I
Okay.
asked
Well,
for was
so
plan.
this seems like there's a couple that are CTE, because Il
Let's
Young's.
bring them all together.
Yeah, Il Young's was around like who's not getting it as opposed to who is getting it. So it just seems like there needs to be a roll
So
up of the
follow-up's
CTE
going to be
data.
CTE pre-K so far is what we've
Well,
seen.
and that it should be, we need a communications plan to create better awareness of what's out there and getting students to take advantage of it.
I think, honestly, we have that during our annual report from our own CTE advisory group. I'm
Well,
worried about.
except that the
You
new
want it yeah.
the new plans or the new accountability metrics by the state require this, and it's part of this report. So we should have follow up in this report.
Okay,
I have a clarifying question on some of these. They're immediate data points that the board would like. We're set to vote on this at the next board meeting. Which one of these are expected prior to that vote? I mean, and which are not? Because I know in the
I don't
past we've
think
had
any
that.
of these. I don't think
None of them?
I
Okay,
mean,
just
can
wanted
I
to be
have
clear.
show of
Just wanted
hands
to be
that
clear.
people are going to be fine passing this report while we wait on our next steps information?
Okay. Because I know in the past there's been a couple we said we need this prior to voting on it. I just want to be clear if there are any, and if not, that's good.
Could I clarify for yours, Ms. Corbett-Sanders? I know there are also some barriers, transportation. I know some schools, half the students are taking, others where they have the academy are not. Can we also have some information about not just the communication plan, but what are some barriers and strategies? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, well, the staff will clean it up to make it more logical later. We'll just get the rest of these voted on. Plan to expand and improve communications with parents to enhance academic achievement, partnering with our community stakeholders. Ms. Keys-Gamarra, does that capture it? Okay, so to enhance enrollment within the AAP program? Okay. I also thought, Ms. Keys-Gamarra, I don't see there, but you and I certainly talked about this, that we would like the superintendent to review our current selection process for AAP because of with respect to our disparities.
Have something in mind. I just don't know about it.
Right. I mean, I do think that, I mean, when you're talking about an annual report on student achievement or student success, and we put AAP in the appendix, which was a comment I didn't make earlier. That doesn't, the old line, you don't put baby in a corner, you don't put AAP in an appendix. I mean, that is a prime program. It is a prime area where we have student achievement gap. That should be in the report, not an appendix. So, but I heard you say that. I heard others say it. I think Ms. Palchuk, you also said it. We do need to have Dr. Brabrand some more analysis on why the achievement, why the opportunity and participation rates for AAP, those gaps persist.
Yes,
okay,
as Francisco
Francis,
said
yeah.
earlier, the equity, two of the themes we heard when we just did our work session on equity were discipline and AAP. So those are probably two of the first that we're going to
They're coming back.
away.
That's why I was asking on the timing of some of these, because some we can include in those future discussions. If it's
Excellent.
not related to the passage of this plan.
Correct, yeah, but I think it's good to have that listed up there. But whoever's typing over there, so for Ms. Keys-Gamara, it really does need to say, it's not just to expand and improve communications with parents, or you're gonna put it there and then add her on, okay? Okay. We're voting on those two. Everybody, hands up in support of it for Ms. Keys-Gamara's. Okay. Expand data on slide 113 to include 9th through 12th grade, the achievement gap in reading by economically disadvantaged and ethnicity. Is that realistic?
Well, it already includes it. It's grades 3 through 8 and end of course, which is the 9th through 12th grade. Now, so it's already a part of that number unless you wanted to disaggregate. Yes. It says 3 through 8 and EOC, which is end of course assessment.
Well, yeah, if that's the case, we should define end of course because that's language that the lay people, including the board members,
We can
may not
clarify
know.
that includes 9th through 12th.
And that's
Absolutely.
the one I would like before the vote, if possible.
Oh, that one we can, that's an easy one, yeah.
Okay. All right, provide data on the effectiveness of non-FCPS programs. Oh,
And if that could just be schedule a work session for early, what are we calling it more, early childhood strategic plan?
It's the Fairfax Equitable School Readiness.
If you can combine the two, that would be great because it's all in one, essentially.
so as part of a follow-up to this report.
Yeah, and it's part of what Ms. Corbett Sanders, said previously. So those two should be one, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, and my question is, does that plan include funding?
It does have for year one funding, and then the stipulation that for future years we'd be bringing back what the funding requirements would be. So
Between the boards.
Schedule work session. Mic on. Schedule work session for Fairfax Equitable School Readiness Strategic Plan, and then we need to go back up to Karen.
Yes.
Well, but it needs to include a conversation on funding.
Okay, so just, delete till where it's,
And then let's see what Karen says. Are we combining these two?
yeah,
Not that one. Karen Corbett Sanders one.
schedule work session. Those are essentially the same. I mean,
Okay.
all right. That's fine. Ms. Palchuk, provide data on the effectiveness of non-FCPS programs and on FCPS non-academic supports that may be missing in K-3 education.
Yeah, so I think this is a little bit the
UVA study that will be coming back each year to report out to the board, so they'll be back again probably the end of the summer.
Is that the only way we gather it?
That's how we're currently gathering it, yes, from the non-FCPS side, absolutely.
So we currently do not collect data from students entering kindergarten who were in non-FCPS programs such as ACA or Family Lit or, well, Early Lit or
So we, last year, we just started including children in CIS that went to publicly funded non-FCPS programs. So those children are only in kindergarten, so we could begin to look at them. But it's only publicly funded. Some of them might be in ACA or other programs.
Okay, because ACA has some public funding.
But the more comprehensive look at what I think what you're asking is going to come in the UVA reports. I think that will be much more meaningful and useful to you than us trying to pull something from the small sample that we do have from last year.
But we'll continue to gather data, is my...
Yes, every year. Mhm.
And then the second part, though, was I'm trying to get at, are there things that are falling off when kids transition from FCPS to kindergarten and elementary school that staff could maybe point out or recommend that we start looking at the elementary level?
The UVA study
We'll
is
have that.
really a comprehensive look at not
Okay.
only families but academic. So it is a comprehensive look to look at. It even, I believe, looks at parent education. So that is one piece. So it is a more robust look that could begin to look at the pieces that you're trying to drill down to. So really, I know it's a hard wait for that data, but I think that's going to give us the best information.
And in the meantime, are there any other maybe less robust reports at the national level or other states that we could just start to gather more information before that comes in?
Definitely. There's definitely longitudinal studies that we could pull for you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we can delete that bullet off because we're going to be getting that in a different manner. Provide information on the changes and impact of updated special ed screening for Spanish speakers.
Yeah, I think I would just change the language there to provide information on the dual language consultations for English learners. And we have data on that and I can share.
All right, everybody in support of that? Okay. Provide information on SAT participation by group and school.
I saw later that we have some...
There is some
Why-
data available in the appendix. Happy to dive in further.
Yeah, if we could get a little bit more by school site. Thank you.
Okay, so we were keeping it, and what we're saying is we wanted it by school.
We also have ACT information on that same chart.
Right, that's another one to watch because our students are taking that at higher rates across ethnicities.
So let's add, provide information on SAT/ACT. Just should, yeah, and then after participation, say rates by school. Okay, all in support of that? Okay, provide number of students not on the pre-K waitlist who are economically disadvantaged and ELL. Ms. Evans?
It should be or, ELL.
And/or.
That's fine.
Right. We don't have that level of detail. What the county has done is give a, if you recall, and Skip, Ms. McLaughlin and Ms. Darren Equifax, they gave us a guesstimate based on the census of the birth rates, but that does not go to the level of whether ELL or not. It's just a guesstimate on the census, the birth rate. So we can provide that number, which actually is part of the strategic plan that we'll be sharing at the work session. So that data point, but that level of specificity we won't have, and we don't have.
Well, if you have whatever you have on that, I'd like to see. So that's
Sure,
fine.
we can do that. The prediction,
And did you capture my other one too?
we can provide the estimated number of students not on the pre-K waiting list. I would leave it at that. Because that's what we do have.
Okay. So who are eligible for the
Who would be eligible, yeah.
Who are eligible for the program but are not on the waiting list.
Right, and it's the estimated. And actually, we're not quite sure who would be eligible because the number comes from the birth rate census, and so it's.
So I realize
we're not
it'll
sure,
be
but
an estimate.
it's an estimated.
Yeah. And then hopefully, oh, go ahead. I mean, and I just wanted to know, because I did have other questions, but is that on the next page? Oh, okay. All right.
Okay, provide the number of students coming into pre-K without school experience by region and by school.
Well, this is going back to that heat map, and rather than doing it by region, I wanted to, I'm looking for the number on that heat map, but by pyramid,
Okay.
not by region, because we have it by region. Provide number of students, coming into kindergarten.
The
yeah,
kindergarten.
right. Coming into kindergarten without pre-K. Right, that's fine. And also the breaking down the weight, I don't know if this is separate or part of this, but breaking down the wait list, the 473 students by elementary school.
Okay, so they'd be able to look at the county's existing wait list for pre-K and see what schools are concentrated in.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
We can get that. We don't have it because some of it's from the county side. We have our own, but we can get that, though.
Okay.
But that would be the strategic focus of where do you need your pre-K seats.
Absolutely, and that's
Yeah.
part of, again, that strategic
Yeah.
planning.
So did you want to show?
All supportive of that
And
data
those last two?
number? Okay. Evaluate implementation and academic impact of FCPS on. When are we getting a briefing on the, because that's when we do with Johns Hopkins, correct?
in summer.
So I think we would probably schedule that for the summer.
Okay. So Dr. Yeah.
So we're not rolling FCPS on into any schools next academic year, right?
No, the rollout or the scaling timeline was to be on hold for 18-19 and to roll out to the remaining high schools in 19-20.
I will tell you there is a lack of clarity around that point. I have more than one of my schools who believe that they are rolling out FCPS on next year.
In September.
This coming
fall.
Year. And so there has to be some clarity because students are saying, oh, we're getting one-to-one devices next year. Principals, staff.
We can follow up with our high school
Be
principals.
absolutely clear that we're still talking about this.
Yes. Yeah, we
We
can
will.
follow up.
Well, now this is where our terminology has to be accurate. High schools, or we're talking high school pyramid? Because then we say just
The
high
point-
schools, so we're not going to do one-to-one
No,
to
the-
all of our middle schools and all of our elementary schools in
Well, we're going to come back to
fall
the
19.
board. The plan was to come back to the board after the community engagement process and year 2 of the Johns Hopkins evaluation was completed and engage in further conversation to see what the board's desire really was on that issue. The plan that we presented at the last work session was to not do any additional scaling during 18-19, but to scale to the remaining high schools that are not currently one-to-one in 19-20. Schools, not pyramid.
Got it. So we only have one pyramid that's one-to-one, but we already have multiple high schools that are one-to-one
We do because we have the e-learning backpack schools that were funded with state funding.
at the high school.
At the high school.
Okay. Dr. Brabrand, in a Brabrand briefing, it would be helpful, I think, to resend out which high schools are part of that. Yeah, because we all know Chantilly pyramid, but I don't think we're clear on which high schools are part of what you just described. Okay, so Mr. Wilson, Mr. Wilson, since this is about this work session, how do you feel since we are already scheduled for this exact question through a different work session? Is it okay if we take this one off? Or do you want it there as a, just make sure everybody knows that the expectations there?
I mean, I don't want to lose this point.
All right.
I mean, but I think the reality is, leave it up there, but we're going to present it at a different point. And so if we
All
have.
right, so everybody's in support. We're looking forward to that, that briefing. Raise your hand. There we go. Yay. Okay. Last one, break out the poverty data by ethnicity. Yeah. I got it from Dr. Presidio, but it needs to be provided to the board and.
So I think we probably want to be a little bit more specific on the measures because, again, there's different numbers of students in the different data sets that we looked at. So what we could try to do is we could try to provide that information for the overall reading, overall math, and overall graduation performance metrics.
Okay. That's okay. So break out the poverty data by ethnicity in the reading, math, and graduation rates.
Mm-hmm.
Overall.
Overall graduation rates. Is that
Overall before the word reading.
all right. Okay. Is everybody all right with that one? Hands in the air. Okay. All right. So this work session is completed. I will go check that offline right now. We will take, because we've been doing this for 2 hours, I will allow a 3-minute run to the facilities as you need to. And yes, we have to transition between on the recording tapes, but please be back ASAP.
Cool.